The Son of God found himself starving, utterly alone, and at his most vulnerable moment when Satan launched his most devastating assaults. This is the rarely told account of those 40 days that shook both heaven and hell. A spiritual confrontation in the barren wilderness that most people profoundly misunderstand. In this video, we're exploring every single moment of Christ's temptation in depth. From the starvation that almost destroyed him, to the 3 precise tests that Satan believed would shatter God's entire plan for salvation. You may think you're familiar with this story, but just wait until you discover what truly occurred during those 40 days of trials. The specifics will absolutely stun you. But first, if you're new here, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing if you haven't done so already. Your support allows us to keep creating more content and delivering value to you. Also, share with us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We're creating a worldwide community right here. Now, shall we begin this story? Infinite waves of sand reach toward a horizon that shimmers exactly like water would. The Judean wilderness breathes with age-old silence. Not the tranquil quietness of a meadow, but something much deeper. Something that weighs against your ears until your own heartbeat becomes audible. This is silence that possesses actual weight. Silence that holds within it the memories of prophets and kings who journeyed here to encounter their God or surrender their sanity. A solitary figure steps into this immensity. His sandals make crunching sounds against stones, polished smooth by countless centuries of wind and sudden floods. Behind him, the Jordan River shrinks smaller, becoming a slender ribbon of life, vanishing into memory. The crowds who observed his baptism fade away like dreams from a distance. Before him stretches only vast emptiness, reaching toward the edge of the known world. This is Jesus of Nazareth, carpenter's son, from a village so tiny that people make jokes about whether anything worthwhile can emerge from there. 30 years old, with hands made rough from wood and stone, a mind formed by scripture and prayer, freshly baptized in the muddy currents of the Jordan. The voice of heaven continues echoing in his mind. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. But now, those words feel remote, like something overheard in a dream that dissolves with the morning light. The wilderness doesn't concern itself with heavenly voices. It measures by entirely different standards. Can you locate water when your tongue becomes swollen with thirst? Can you discover food when your stomach consumes itself with hunger? Can you endure when everything familiar strips away and only the naked truth of existence persists? This story takes shape in the territory between divine calling and human weakness. Between the instant God speaks and the instant we must decide what to do with that voice. It's a cosmic struggle dressed in the ordinary garments of hunger, isolation, and uncertainty. The destiny of creation hangs in the balance, yet the battleground appears to be nothing more than rocks and sand and a man walking alone into nothingness. The sun ascends higher, a pitiless eye that observes everything and pardons nothing. Jesus adjusts his coarse, woven cloak and continues walking. Each step carries him deeper into a place where only truth endures, where facades burn away like morning mist, where the most profound questions demand answers that cannot be borrowed from books or taken from teachers. What does it actually mean to be chosen by God? What price does divine calling extract from human flesh? And when the voice of heaven becomes quiet, how do we know we haven't simply imagined it all? How do we distinguish between holy vision and the madness that deserts bring? The wilderness knows these questions intimately. It has tested prophets and kings, hermits and seekers, rebels and dreamers. David concealed himself here from Saul's envious fury, composing psalms in caves that still echo in synagogue prayers today. John the Baptist matured here, nourished on locusts and wild honey, learning to hear God's voice in the wind that howls through canyon passages. Now it stands ready to test the one who claims to be greater than all of these. Desert silence consumes his footsteps. No birds offer songs here. No insects create buzzing sounds. Even the wind seems to hold its breath, as if anticipating something about to commence. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circles, riding unseen currents of superheated air. Its cry pierces through the stillness like a knife. The sole sound, in a world that appears to have forgotten how to speak. Jesus stops moving. He glances back once toward the river, toward the crowds who witnessed his baptism with amazement and bewilderment. Some dropped to their knees when the dove made its descent. Others stepped away, suddenly conscious they were observing something beyond their comprehension. John the Baptist gave a slow nod, as if a question held for a long time had finally received its answer. But all of that seems like a different lifetime now. He turns his face toward the heart of the wasteland, toward 40 days that will shape everything, toward testing that will establish whether the voice at the Jordan was God's calling or his own desperate longing dressed up as divine revelation. This is where our story actually begins. Not in a palace where power establishes its residence, not in a temple where religion carries out its rituals, but in the most abandoned corner of the world, where heaven and earth converge in the arena of the human heart, where the struggle for the soul of creation will be waged with words, not swords, with decisions, not armies, with one man's readiness to confront the ultimate questions about identity, purpose, and the character of divine love. The wilderness remains patient as stone, hungry as time itself, ancient as the very first sunrise. It has been waiting since the world's beginning for this moment. This man, this testing that will reverberate through eternity. Heat ascends from stone like invisible flames. Lizards dart between rocks, the only movement in a landscape resembling the surface of a lifeless planet. In the distance, mountains rise like shattered teeth against a sky so intensely blue it pains the eyes to look at it directly. And so the testing commences, not with trumpets or thunder, but with silence so absolute it makes your bones ache. Not with obvious spectacle, but with the gradual pressure of solitude that strips away everything except what matters most profoundly. The beloved Son walks deeper into emptiness. Each step becomes an act of faith. Each breath transforms into a prayer. Each heartbeat serves as a drumbeat, counting time until the moment when divine calling encounters its greatest test. The wilderness spreads its arms like a lover, like a tomb, like a womb that gives birth to prophets or buries those who merely pretend. Welcome to the place where souls get sorted, where the genuine is separated from the imagined, where the voice of God meets the voice of doubt in a combat that will shake the very foundations of the world. The baptism and the descent. Water tumbles from John's cupped hands like liquid diamonds. Each droplet captures sunlight, casting tiny rainbows across the muddy surface of the Jordan River. The Baptist's rough hands show gentleness as he raises water over the head of the man, standing waist-deep in the current. Witnesses crowd the muddy banks, drawn by rumors of the wild prophet who speaks of approaching judgment with words that burn like fire. John himself appears different today. The usual fierce confidence wavers, replaced by something resembling reverence. His camel hair garment drapes loosely on his gaunt frame. Locusts and wild honey have kept him alive for years in the wilderness, giving him the lean appearance of a man who consumes only what God supplies. His eyes blaze with the intensity of someone who has glimpsed beyond the veil of ordinary existence. "I need to be baptized by you," he stated when Jesus first came forward. "And do you come to me?" The question lingered in the air like incense, heavy with recognition that something without precedent was unfolding. The student requesting to baptize the teacher, the herald preparing to anoint the king. But Jesus was insistent. "Let it be so now, for thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness," words that held deeper significance than the crowd could comprehend. Not merely submission to ritual, but acceptance of the complete human experience. Not just symbolism, but solidarity with every soul who ever felt the need for cleansing, forgiveness, a fresh beginning. Now arrives the moment that transforms everything. Water streams from Jesus' hair and beard as he emerges from the river's embrace. Drops fall like tears of joy back into the current that will transport them toward the Dead Sea. The crowd shifts restlessly, sensing something beyond their understanding is preparing to reveal itself. The sky rips open, not metaphorically, not in some concealed spiritual dimension invisible to human eyes, but literally, dramatically, impossibly. The heavens split like fabric under divine hands, and light floods through. Not the harsh light of desert sun, but something gentler, more golden, more alive. Light that carries melody just beyond the threshold of human hearing. A dove makes its descent through that tear in reality. Wings stretched wide, capturing the strange light like sails catching wind. It moves with purpose that contradicts nature, settling on Jesus' shoulder with impossible gentleness. The crowd releases a collective gasp. Some drop to their knees. Others retreat, suddenly aware they're witnessing something that will be remembered until time's end. Then arrives the voice. Deep as thunder rolling across distant mountains, soft as a whisper between lovers, speaking words that will echo through eternity. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Not heard by everyone, but perceived by all. A vibration that originates in the bones and radiates outward until even stones appear to tremble with recognition. The crowd stirs like wheat in wind. Some push forward, desperate to touch the hem of his garment. Others stumble backward, overwhelmed by nearness to the divine. Children conceal themselves behind their mothers' robes. Fishermen abandon their nets. Tax collectors lose track of their calculations. For one eternal moment, heaven invades earth, and nothing will ever remain the same. John the Baptist gives a slow nod, as if a question held for a long time has finally received its answer. Years of waiting, preaching, preparing the way, have culminated in this moment. The one greater than himself has finally made his appearance. The Lamb of God who removes the sin of the world stands dripping river water in afternoon sunlight. Jesus stands in the shallows, water streaming from his hair and beard like a second baptism. The dove's weight on his shoulder feels simultaneously light as air and heavy as destiny. Its dark eyes mirror mysteries older than creation. The voice diminishes, but its echo persists in his bones, in his blood, in the deepest chambers of his heart. This moment should mark the beginning of triumph, the launching platform for a ministry that will heal the sick, raise the dead, and proclaim good news to the poor, the foundation for gathering disciples and performing miracles that will convince the world of God's love. Instead, it becomes the first step toward isolation that will test every word of heavenly affirmation. The Spirit that descended like a dove now transforms into a driving wind, not harsh or violent, but insistent as gravity, like a current that captures a leaf and carries it far from where it intended to travel. Jesus perceives the pull toward barren places, toward silence, toward testing that will demonstrate whether heavenly words translate into earthly faithfulness. He departs from the river without ceremony. No disciples follow yet. No crowds press for miracles. No scribes demand signs or Pharisees present theological challenges. The voice of heaven has declared itself. But now arrives the harder question. What does that voice actually signify? What does it cost to be beloved? What does sonship demand? The path leads upward, away from the green stripe of the Jordan Valley, where date palms offer shade and springs bubble with sweet water. Each step carries him higher into rocky hills, where only thorns and lizards flourish. Where the sun beats down without compassion, and shade becomes more precious than gold itself. The sounds of humanity diminish behind him like a song becoming distant, voices of fishermen repairing nets. Laughter of children engaged in village squares, merchants announcing their wares in marketplace chatter. All of it becomes faint, then silent, then merely memory carried in the wind. This is the pattern of divine calling throughout history. Affirmation followed by isolation. Blessing followed by testing. The voice that declares beloved must be tested by voices that whisper, prove it. Heaven's approval must survive hell's interrogation. Jesus walks steadily, his carpenter's muscles adapting to the uneven terrain of limestone ridges and concealed valleys. Behind him, the dove returns to whatever realm produced it. Ahead stretches the wilderness that has been waiting since the world began for this moment. This man, this testing that will establish the fate of creation. Some might question why the Spirit guides the beloved Son into such desolation. Why not to Jerusalem to commence teaching in the temple courts where learned men engage in scripture debates? Why not to Galilee to assemble followers and perform miracles among people who knew him as a child? Why not to Rome to confront power at its origin? But the wilderness provides something that crowds cannot deliver. It strips away everything except what matters most profoundly. In the silence, you perceive truth. In the emptiness, you discover what you actually carry within. In the testing, you learn whether faith is genuine or just wishful thinking dressed up in religious vocabulary. The baptism is concluded. The divine voice has declared itself. The descent into testing commences. And somewhere in the back of his expanding consciousness, Jesus begins to comprehend that being chosen doesn't mean being shielded from struggle. It means being entrusted with the most difficult questions of all. The river becomes distant. The wilderness spreads its arms like a patient lover. And the beloved Son walks forward into the embrace of absolute silence, carrying heaven's approval into hell's territory. The wilderness calls out. The first thing that strikes you is the heat, not the pleasant warmth of a summer day that invites you to remain in garden shade, but something aggressive that presses against your skin like a living creature with teeth and claws. By midday, when the sun reaches its pitiless zenith, the rocks become too scorching to touch with bare skin. Lizards vanish into whatever cracks and crevices they can discover, their tiny bodies seeking shelter from temperatures that could literally cook flesh. This is the Judean wilderness, a landscape resembling the surface of an alien planet, hostile to human life, indifferent to human hope. Limestone ridges carved by ancient floods ascend and descend like the backbone of some buried giant. Canyons plunge into shadow so profound that noon transforms into twilight. Scattered patches of scrub brush somehow endure on almost no water. Their thorny branches stretching toward a sky that provides light but minimal mercy. Jesus navigates his way along paths worn by centuries of pilgrims, hermits, rebels, and madmen. Each has journeyed here seeking something different. Some discovered God in the silence. Others found only bones bleaching white under relentless sun. The wilderness maintains no record of success or failure. It simply waits, patient as stone, for the next seeker to test their faith against its reality. The silence here possesses physical weight. It presses against your eardrums until you perceive things that aren't present. Your own pulse becomes as loud as temple drums. Your breathing sounds harsh and labored, even when you're standing completely still. The absence of human noise becomes so absolute that the smallest sound, a pebble rolling down a slope, a lizard scurrying between rocks, appears loud as thunder. Every step demands conscious decision. Place your foot incorrectly on loose stone, and you could twist an ankle. Select the wrong path, and you could walk in circles until thirst claims your life. Overlook the subtle indicators that reveal water nearby, and you could perish within sight of salvation. The wilderness delivers harsh lessons with unforgiving clarity. Attention equals survival. Carelessness equals death. By evening, the heat shatters like a fever that has completed its course. Temperature drops dramatically as the sun vanishes behind western hills, transforming the furnace of day into the freezer of night. Stars materialize in numbers that city dwellers never witness, so abundant they resemble spilled salt across black cloth. The Milky Way extends across the sky like a river of light, reminding anyone who gazes up that they are exceedingly small and exceedingly alone in a cosmos of unimaginable magnitude. But night delivers no comfort to weary travelers. Cold penetrates through the thickest cloak like water through cloth. Rocks that scorched your feet at noon now steal warmth from your body with the efficiency of vampires. You curl up in whatever shelter you can locate. A depression in stone, an overhang carved by ancient floods, and wait for dawn while your teeth chatter and your bones ache with cold. This is where prophets have always journeyed to die or be reborn. Elijah escaped here when Queen Jezebel threatened his life, surviving on bread delivered by ravens, while he wrestled with despair so profound he asked God to let him die. Moses spent 40 years in wilderness exactly like this, before the burning bush summoned him back to Egypt with news that would alter history. David concealed himself in desert caves when King Saul's envy transformed into murderous rage, composing psalms that still resonate in synagogue prayers 2,000 years later. The landscape delivers lessons that cannot be absorbed in comfortable places. Water becomes more valuable than gold. Shade becomes more precious than silver. Every decision carries consequences measured in terms of survival or death. There's no space for pretense here, no audience to impress with false piety or borrowed wisdom, only you and the questions that matter most profoundly. Who are you when all supports vanish? What do you believe when belief delivers no comfort? Whom do you trust when trust provides no safety? Jesus discovers a cave carved by some ancient flash flood, its entrance facing east to capture the first rays of morning light while remaining relatively cool through the brutal afternoon hours. A small overhang offers shelter from the occasional storm that transforms dry creek beds into raging torrents for a few violent hours before vanishing back into desert silence. This will serve as home for 40 days and 40 nights, nearly 6 weeks of solitude, in a place that pardons no mistakes and provides no second chances. He arranges stones into a rough circle for sleeping, the nearest thing to a bed that this place offers. He collects scrub wood for small fires that will keep predators at bay during the long nights when darkness brings not just cold, but also the sounds of hunting animals echoing through canyon walls. He examines the ground for the few hardy plants that might supply emergency food if desperation requires it. Wild onions, concealing themselves in rocky crevices. Bitter roots that could maintain life for a few days. Seeds that birds drop and abandon. But food is not the purpose of this journey, any more than comfort or safety or the normal human needs that drive most decisions. The wilderness strips away everything except essence, everything except the core questions that define who you are and what you're prepared to become. When all the props and supports of ordinary life disappear like morning mist, wind moans through the canyon walls, producing sounds like distant voices, sometimes like weeping, sometimes like laughter. Sometimes like conversations in languages you almost comprehend but can never quite grasp. Always like something just beyond the edge of understanding, something that might be divine communication or might just be physics playing tricks on ears that strain for meaning in meaningless sound. The first night passes with agonizing slowness. Jesus lies on his back on the stone circle he has arranged, observing stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. The voice from his baptism, "This is my beloved Son," seems like something from another lifetime, something that occurred to someone else in a world far removed from this place of rock and silence. Here in this crucible of solitude, even the memory of God feels remote. The dove that descended at the Jordan might have been a hallucination brought on by religious excitement. The voice might have been wishful thinking, amplified by crowd psychology. How do you distinguish between divine revelation and human desperation when you're alone with your thoughts, in a place where thoughts echo like voices in an empty room? Morning arrives with harsh light and returning heat that builds like pressure in a boiler. Another day commences in the place where souls go to be tested, where the difference between divine calling and human delusion gets determined in the crucible of absolute honesty, where pretense burns away like dew under the desert sun. The wilderness calls deeper, further from everything familiar and comfortable, closer to whatever truth awaits at the center of solitude, at the heart of testing, at the core of the question that has brought him here. Is the voice of God genuine, or just the echo of human hope in a universe that doesn't concern itself with human dreams? Jesus, beloved Son, carpenter, prophet, man, takes another step into the heart of emptiness. The testing has only just commenced. 40 days. Numbers carry significance in the ancient world, like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread far beyond their apparent meaning. 7 signifies completeness, the rhythm of creation itself. 12 represents God's chosen people, tribes assembled under divine promise. But 40 signifies testing that transforms, trial that either shatters or remakes, time sufficient for death and rebirth. Rain descended for 40 days, when Noah observed the world drown and be reborn, floating in an ark, while everything familiar vanished beneath waters of judgment. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai's smoking peak, receiving laws that would form a nation, while his face grew so radiant with divine glory that people couldn't gaze at him directly. The Israelites wandered 40 years in wilderness just like this one, learning to trust God's provision when manna materialized each morning like dew and vanished if hoarded beyond the day's need. 40 days strips away everything superficial, everything pretended, everything that passes for real in the comfortable world of human civilization, long enough for hunger to become a constant companion that gnaws with teeth and claws, long enough for solitude to press against the mind until thoughts echo like voices in an empty cathedral, long enough for all pretense to burn away under desert sun that shows no mercy to lies or half-truths. Jesus settles into the rhythm of wilderness life with the practiced efficiency of someone who understands how to work with his hands. Dawn delivers relief from night's bitter cold that penetrates through stone and cloth and skin until your bones ache with chill. He emerges from his cave shelter like a bear from hibernation, joints stiff from sleeping on rock, muscles protesting the unforgiving hardness that has become his bed. Morning light paints the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, creating beauty so stark it steals your breath. For a few precious minutes, the desert reveals its gentler face. Temperature hovers at the edge of comfortable. Wind carries the faint scent of distant rain. Birds that hide during the day's brutal heat emerge to hunt insects and deliver brief songs before the sun climbs high enough to send them back into whatever shade they can locate. The first week passes with stubborn determination that originates from muscles accustomed to hard work and a mind trained by years of scripture, study, and prayer. His body draws on stored strength, accumulated through years of carpenter's labor, lifting beams, shaping stone, wielding tools that require both precision and power. His mind remains relatively sharp, focused on prayer and meditation that follow patterns learned in childhood synagogue attendance and maintained through decades of morning and evening devotions. The voice from his baptism stays clear during these early days, an anchor point in the growing silence. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The words carry weight that appears to increase rather than diminish with repetition. Memory becomes a lifeline, connection to reality beyond the expanding emptiness of desert solitude. But hunger possesses patience equal to the rocks that surround him. It doesn't announce itself with sudden drama or overwhelming demand. Instead, it advances slowly like water seeping through limestone, like shadow progressing across sand. First arrives the occasional rumble in an empty stomach, easily dismissed by someone accustomed to hard work that sometimes delayed meals. Then the persistent ache that makes concentration difficult, thoughts sluggish, prayers harder to sustain. By the second week, food transforms into an obsession that intrudes into every waking moment and haunts the uneasy sleep that comes fitfully on stone beds. Every bush might conceal edible berries. Every crevice might contain eggs abandoned by nesting birds or insects that could supply protein to sustain life a few more days. His body commences the slow process of consuming itself, burning muscle and fat to maintain vital organs functioning, while the mind grows lightheaded and strange. Dreams transform in character during the second week, converting from the normal chaos of daily processing into something more focused and tormenting. Instead of childhood memories or theological reflections, sleep delivers elaborate banquets, tables groaning under the weight of fresh bread and roasted meat and wine that glows like liquid rubies in golden cups. He awakens to discover only stone and sand, and the taste of dust coating his mouth like ash. The third week delivers weakness that settles in his bones like an unwelcome guest who has no intention of departing. Standing demands conscious effort and careful balance. Walking becomes a careful negotiation with gravity that threatens to pull him down among the rocks where vultures could pick his bones clean. His hands develop a constant tremor that makes simple tasks, arranging stones for meditation, scratching marks in sand to count passing days, require multiple attempts. Yet something else materializes from the advancing hunger. Something unexpected and strangely welcome, a clarity that emerges when all distractions fall away like unnecessary clothing. Prayer becomes less about words carefully arranged in proper sequence and more about simple presence, breathing in and out while consciousness floats in the space between earth and sky. The boundary between himself and the surrounding silence begins to blur like watercolors running together in rain. Week 4 arrives with hallucinations that dance at the edge of vision, like heat waves made visible. Movements that vanish when he turns his head directly toward them. Voices that might be wind echoing through canyon walls, or might be something else entirely. Something that speaks in languages he almost comprehends but can never quite grasp. The line between reality and imagination becomes as shifting and unreliable as sand dunes sculpted by wind. His clothes hang loose now, draped over a frame that grows more skeletal each day. Ribs display clearly beneath skin, stretched tight as drum heads. His beard grows wild and unkempt. No longer the neat whiskers of a village carpenter, but the tangled growth of a hermit or madman. Anyone observing him would think desert-crazed or religious fanatic, not beloved Son of God. The transformation is both physical and spiritual, a stripping away that penetrates deeper than flesh to touch the core of identity itself. But this is precisely the purpose of wilderness testing. Strip away everything external, everything that depends on circumstances or other people's opinions or the comfortable supports of civilization. Remove all props and crutches and safety nets. What remains when nothing remains? What survives when survival itself becomes questionable? Who are you when everything that usually defines you disappears like mirages in desert heat? The voice from his baptism grows fainter with each passing day, like an echo, fading into silence. Did God really speak those words of affirmation? Did the dove really descend from heaven's torn fabric? Or was it all wishful thinking, the desperate hope of a carpenter's son who wanted to believe he was special in a world that treats most people as expendable? Doubt creeps in with the hunger, subtle as poison, patient as desert erosion that wears away mountains grain by grain over geological time. Self-questioning becomes as constant as the ache in his belly, as persistent as the weakness in his bones. Every remembered moment of divine calling gets examined under the harsh light of wilderness reality, dissected like a corpse on a physician's table, held up to scrutiny that discovers flaws in everything. This is the genuine testing that the wilderness provides. not some external trial imposed by a demanding deity who enjoys watching creatures suffer, but the natural result of removing all supports until only bedrock truth remains. What do you believe when believing delivers no comfort, no relief, no improvement in circumstances? What do you trust when trust provides no safety, no guarantee, no protection from pain? Night after night, he lies on stone beds that grow no softer with repetition and gazes at stars that provide no answers to the questions that gnaw with more persistence than hunger. Day after day, he walks among rocks that offer no food, no water, no shelter from sun that beats down like hammer blows on an anvil. The wilderness becomes a mirror that reflects only what's actually present, stripping away illusion and pretense until only naked truth remains. 40 days. Long enough for transformation that penetrates deeper than death, more complete than birth. Long enough for a carpenter's son to discover whether the voice that called him beloved was genuine or merely the desert wind playing tricks on ears that strain for meaning in meaningless sound. The testing continues with patience that makes stones seem restless. The answer waits somewhere beyond the next dawn, the next night, the next moment when choice will determine destiny. The adversary materializes. On the 40th day, when hunger has transformed into a living thing with teeth and claws that gnaw constantly at his insides, when weakness has settled in his bones like an unwelcome guest with no intention of departing, when solitude has pressed against his mind until thoughts echo like whispers in an empty cathedral. On this day, the silence shatters, not with thunder rolling across distant mountains or earthquake that makes the ground tremble beneath his feet, but with something more unsettling. Something that makes the very air feel different, charged with potential, like the moment before lightning strikes. A presence that causes every hair on his body to stand alert to danger that has no visible source. Jesus sits in the meager shade of his cave shelter, conserving what little strength persists in a body that has consumed itself down to essence. His frame has become skeletal, bones displaying clearly beneath skin, stretched tight as parchment. Ribs stand out like the hull of a shipwreck, exposed by receding tide. His hands shake with the constant tremor of starvation, making even simple movements require conscious effort and multiple attempts. Then arrives the voice, smooth as silk drawn across bare skin, reasonable as a merchant discussing the weather before proposing a business transaction. Not harsh or obviously evil, not accompanied by sulfur and brimstone, and all the theatrical elements that human imagination associates with demonic presence. Instead, something that makes the wilderness itself appear to hold its breath in anticipation. If you are the Son of God. The words linger in the superheated air like smoke from an invisible fire. Jesus raises his head slowly, scanning the empty landscape with eyes that have grown accustomed to seeing mirages dance where no water exists. Nothing moves except heat waves rising from sun-baked stone like transparent flames. No figure materializes among the rocks. No shadow falls where no shadow should exist. Who speaks? What speaks? The question has troubled theologians for 2,000 years, spawning debates that fill libraries and divide denominations. Some envision a literal devil, red-skinned and horned like illustrations in medieval manuscripts. Others imagine a fallen angel, beautiful and terrible as Lucifer before the fall, wielding power that could reshape creation itself. Still others wonder if the voice originates from within. The inevitable result of 40 days alone with hunger and doubt and the pressure of solitude that can drive even strong minds to the edge of madness. But perhaps the identity matters less than the method employed. The adversary doesn't arrive with obvious evil that any fool could recognize and reject. No temptation to murder innocent children or steal from widows or curse the God who created the stars. Instead, he arrives with reasonable suggestions, practical solutions, ways to solve immediate problems that cause genuine suffering. If you are the Son of God, Notice the surgical precision of the approach. Not "you are not the Son of God," which would be too obvious, too easy to reject with righteous indignation. That would be the blunt instrument of amateur temptation. Instead, a conditional statement that plants doubt like a seed in soil made fertile by 40 days of questioning everything. If you are who you claim to be, then surely certain logical conclusions follow. Surely certain practical applications make sense. The wilderness has prepared Jesus for this moment with the efficiency of a master teacher. 40 days of stripping away everything but core identity. 40 days of questioning every assumption about calling and purpose and divine love. 40 days of discovering what remains when all supports disappear like morning mist under desert sun. The voice arrives again, closer now, though still invisible, carrying weight that seems to make the very stones pay attention. Patient as a cat observing a mouse, confident as a gambler holding cards that can't lose. If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread. Simple, reasonable, solve the hunger that gnaws like acid in your empty stomach. Prove your divine nature with a practical miracle that helps rather than harms. Use the power that flows in your veins to meet the most basic human need. What could possibly be wrong with feeding yourself after 40 days of voluntary fasting that has brought you to the edge of death itself? Jesus gazes down at the stones scattered around his feet like dice thrown by an invisible hand. Limestone worn smooth by ancient floods, shaped by wind and rain into forms that almost resemble loaves of bread if you observe them with eyes dimmed by hunger and desperation. In his weakened state, they seem to pulse with possibility, begging for transformation that would end suffering and restore strength. The temptation reveals its true nature, not in what it obviously suggests, but in what it subtly assumes. That comfort is the highest good worth pursuing, that avoiding suffering is the primary goal of existence, that power exists to serve the self first and foremost, with service to others being secondary consideration, at best. But Jesus remembers different stories learned at his mother's knee and reinforced through years of synagogue attendance and private study. Abraham, departing from the comfort of Ur for uncertainty in Canaan because God summoned him to something greater than safety. Moses, choosing identification with Hebrew slaves over privilege in Pharaoh's house because justice mattered more than personal advancement. David refusing to kill Saul, though he had opportunity and justification, because some principles transcend expedience. The adversary waits with infinite patience, as if time itself serves his purposes. No pressure, no threats, no obvious coercion, just a reasonable suggestion lingering in the air like incense, growing more appealing with each passing moment as hunger continues its relentless work on a body pushed beyond normal endurance. This is how genuine testing arrives. Not with obvious evil that any child could recognize and reject with Sunday school righteousness, but with solutions that make perfect sense to minds focused on immediate problems, with shortcuts that seem almost wise in their practicality, with alternatives that offer relief from the very suffering that shapes character and builds faith, strong enough to survive life's inevitable storms. Jesus perceives the hunger gnawing at his insides like a living thing with its own agenda, feels the weakness that makes even breathing require conscious effort. The stones wait at his feet like sleeping possibilities, ready to become whatever he commands if he chooses to use the power that thrums in his blood like electricity waiting for a conductor. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cries. The sound cuts through the silence like a blade, breaking the spell that was beginning to weave itself around his consciousness, reminding him that he is not alone here, that someone else observes this exchange with interest that goes deeper than mere curiosity. The adversary's voice carries just a hint of impatience now. The first crack in a facade of infinite patience, as if the answer should be obvious to anyone with basic intelligence and normal concern for self-preservation. As if only stubborn pride or religious fanaticism would prevent such a simple solution to such a fundamental problem. If you are the Son of God." The words echo off canyon walls, multiplying until they seem to originate from every direction at once. The testing has moved beyond preliminary observation into active engagement. The genuine battle is about to commence. The first temptation, stones to bread. Hunger becomes a living entity after 40 days of voluntary fasting. Not the simple emptiness of a missed meal that makes your stomach rumble during a morning meeting, but something with teeth and claws that gnaws constantly at your insides. Something that whispers relentlessly in the back of your mind with the persistence of ocean waves. Food, food, food. The human body, designed for survival, begins consuming itself when external nourishment vanishes. First, it burns through stored fat, then muscle tissue, finally threatening vital organs if the fast continues much longer. Jesus has reached that dangerous threshold where medical intervention might be necessary to prevent permanent damage or death itself. He gazes down at the stones, scattered around his feet like ancient dice thrown by some cosmic gambler. Smooth limestone worn round by centuries of flash floods that roar through desert canyons during the brief but violent storms that sometimes grace this wilderness. In his weakened state, lightheaded from starvation, they almost appear to glow with inner potential, begging for transformation that would end suffering and restore strength. The voice arrives again, reasonable and patient as a teacher, explaining simple mathematics to a slow student. "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." Such a simple request when you think about it logically. Such an obvious solution to an immediate problem that threatens life itself. After all, what good is divine power if it can't meet the most basic human needs? What purpose does miraculous ability serve if not to prevent suffering when suffering becomes genuinely dangerous? The stone that draws his attention fits perfectly in his palm, as if shaped by divine hands for this specific moment. Warm from the desert sun that has beaten down mercilessly for hours, smooth as a river pebble, roughly the size and shape of a small loaf of bread. He closes his eyes and feels the weakness that originates from a body consuming itself to survive. Muscle and fat burned away to keep vital organs functioning, the constant ache that makes concentration nearly impossible. Thoughts fragmented like pottery shards, scattered across sand. Bread, the word itself carries weight that transcends mere nutrition. Fresh from his mother's oven back in Nazareth, crusty outside and soft within, still warm from baking that filled the house with yeast and grain perfume. The satisfaction of fullness replacing the gnawing emptiness that has become his constant companion these 40 days. His mouth waters at the memory, saliva made precious by weeks of rationing even that basic bodily function. He possesses the power, deep in his bones, in the marrow where blood is made and life sustained. He knows this truth beyond doubt or question. The same voice that spoke worlds into existence from nothing more than divine will flows in his veins like electricity, seeking a conductor. The same creative word that formed Adam from dust and breathed into him the breath of life could transform limestone into grain with less effort than a thought requires. Stone to bread requires only will and word, intention and command. A simple miracle to solve an immediate problem that threatens death itself. Not some grand gesture designed to impress crowds or convince skeptics, just practical application of divine power to meet the most basic human need. Who could argue with that logic? What reasonable person would choose suffering when relief lies within easy reach? But something stops him before the word of command can form on his lips. Some memory that cuts through the fog of hunger and weakness like sunlight through storm clouds. Words learned as a child at his mother's knee, repeated in synagogue until they became part of his breathing, carved into his consciousness like commandments on stone tablets. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. The phrase rises from depths deeper than hunger, more fundamental than physical need. Moses spoke these words to the Israelites during their own wilderness wandering, reminding them of lessons learned through 40 years of desert education. When they complained about food, longing for the meat pots of Egypt, God provided manna, bread from heaven that materialized each morning like dew, sustaining life while teaching deeper truths about dependence and trust. But the real lesson wasn't about bread at all. It was about the nature of sustenance itself. What truly feeds the human soul? What actually satisfies the deepest hungers that gnaw at consciousness? Physical food maintains the body for a few hours before hunger returns. But the Word of God feeds something eternal, something that neither hunger nor fullness can touch. Jesus opens his eyes and gazes at the stone in his trembling palm. Still warm from desert sun, still perfectly shaped for transformation, still possible to become bread if he speaks the word that would end suffering and restore strength. The adversary waits with infinite patience, confident that survival instinct will eventually overcome abstract theological principles. Man does not live by bread alone. The words emerge as a whisper, voice cracked and rough from weeks of minimal speech in the desert silence. But they carry weight that makes the very air seem to tremble with recognition. Not a shouted rejection full of righteous indignation, but something deeper, a choice made in the quiet place where identity gets decided and character gets forged in the fires of testing. This confrontation reveals itself as concerning much more than hunger or bread or even survival itself. It's about the nature of power and how divine gifts should be employed. Will miraculous ability serve comfort or calling? Will supernatural strength be used to avoid suffering or to enter more fully into the human condition that includes suffering as an essential component? The stone could become bread with a word. The hunger could end with a command. The suffering could stop with a simple exercise of divine prerogative. But at what cost? What precedent would be established? What path would be chosen for the ministry that must follow this testing? If the Son of God uses his divine nature to escape the limitations of human existence, what hope does that offer to ordinary people who face hunger without miraculous options? If power becomes a tool for personal comfort, how can it later be trusted to serve the greater good? If the first response to suffering is to eliminate it through supernatural means, what message does that send about the value of endurance, patience, and trust in God's timing? Jesus gazes up at the empty sky, then back at the stone in his hand. The adversary's presence presses against the silence like heat before a storm, waiting and watching with the confidence of someone who has never seen this gambit fail. Physical need eventually conquers spiritual ideals in every previous case. Survival instinct ultimately overrides religious sentiment when death becomes a real possibility. But hunger is not the deepest human need, despite its urgent demands and obvious requirements. The body needs bread to function, yes, but the soul needs something else entirely, something that cannot be manufactured from stones or summoned by will or created through miraculous intervention. The soul needs trust that penetrates deeper than circumstances, faith that survives when all supports disappear, connection to something beyond the immediate and pressing demands of flesh and blood and survival itself. The soul needs to know that it is loved, not because of what it can do or produce or achieve, but simply because it exists by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Jesus places the stone back on the ground with hands that shake from weakness, but remain steady in purpose. The hunger continues. The weakness persists. The suffering maintains its relentless pressure. But something else remains too, something that hunger cannot touch and weakness cannot diminish. He remembers the voice at his baptism. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Not beloved because of miraculous power or divine abilities, not pleasing because of supernatural achievements or religious accomplishments. Simply beloved, simply pleasing, simply accepted and affirmed for who he is, rather than what he can do. The first temptation passes like a fever, breaking after a long illness. The adversary's presence shifts and recalculates, like a chess player whose opening gambit has been unexpectedly countered. This was supposed to be the easy test, the obvious one, the challenge that any sensible person focused on survival would inevitably fail. But the stones remain stones. The man who could have fed himself chooses instead to feed on something invisible, something that sustains even when the body wastes away to skin and bones. And somewhere in the heart of divine calling, a precedent takes root that will shape everything that follows. Power serves love rather than self. Strength chooses vulnerability over invulnerability. Divine ability finds its highest expression not in eliminating suffering, but in transforming it into something meaningful. The testing continues, but the first battle has been won through surrender rather than conquest, through trust rather than control. The wilderness watches with ancient patience. The adversary prepares his next approach, and the beloved son discovers that some hungers can only be satisfied by choosing not to satisfy them at all. The character of authority. The rock rests in the place where Jesus set it down, heat still radiating from the desert sun and the warmth of human contact. A modest marker of decision that holds consequences extending well past this instant of trial, an unremarkable item to carry such universal significance, an everyday choice to establish the essential character of heavenly purpose and the rightful application of miraculous ability. Authority over physical substance, authority over the forces governing material existence, authority to change one element into something else through nothing beyond verbal command and concentrated intention. This represents what the enemy presented through his seemingly logical proposal and what Jesus rejected through his quiet reference to age-old writings. But for what reason? What truth directed that rejection? What underlying reality made remaining hungry more acceptable than ending hunger when relief existed within simple grasp? Out in the barren lands, each decision takes on magnified importance, like visions observed through hot air that warps illumination and twists perception. Remove every distraction, every comfort, every familiar assumption that softens regular existence, and what's left? The essential questions that determine your identity and your willingness to transform when all that's known vanishes like dawn vapor beneath the unforgiving clarity of wilderness light. Jesus understands with absolute certainty that he holds the capacity to turn rock into nourishment. The identical creative energy that voiced existence into being from original emptiness courses through him like current searching for connection. The same heavenly expression that shaped Adam from earth and filled him with living breath could reform stone into grain, requiring less exertion than a single heartbeat demands. This concern doesn't involve capability or feasibility. It concerns intention and foundation, concerning proper power application and what deserves to be served. The Hebrew people encountered comparable testing throughout their desert years, absorbing teachings that resound through time into this instance of isolated examination. When starvation weighed upon them with tangible heaviness, they protested to Moses with tones heavy with longing and remorse. If only we had perished in Egypt, where we rested beside the cooking pots and consumed food until satisfied. They recalled captivity as superior to independence, requiring belief, enslavement as preferable to freedom containing unknowns, the Almighty furnished manna responding to their grievances. Sustenance from above that materialized every dawn like moisture, pale as ice crystals, pleasant as nectar, adequate for daily requirements, nothing beyond. Yet, the teaching went further than basic nourishment. The manna arrived with stipulations that conveyed truths more vital than nutrition. Collect solely what you require for today's continuation. Have confidence that tomorrow's portion will manifest when tomorrow comes. Acquire reliance that strangely converts into the most profound form of assurance. Several attempted to stockpile additional manna, preserving it against coming uncertainty, disregarding clear directions to gather only immediate necessities for present use. Come daybreak, their stored provisions teemed with larvae and reeked of corruption, a foul demonstration that safety cannot be preserved in worldly vessels. The teaching carved itself deeply into Hebrew awareness. Confidence must renew daily like the ascending sun. Belief cannot accumulate like riches in vigilantly protected storage. Jesus confronts the identical basic decision at this moment. Though his situation differs from the protesting Israelites, employ divine capacity to remove uncertainty and secure ease, or welcome uncertainty as the precise location where belief develops strong enough to withstand existence's unavoidable tempests. Generate safety through miraculous capability, or discover safety in miraculous connection that surpasses conditions. The enemy's proposition exposes its authentic character, not through what it transparently suggests, but through what it quietly presumes regarding the correct balance between authority and aim. That ease represents the supreme benefit worth seeking. That preventing hardship constitutes the fundamental objective of being. That heavenly endowments exist chiefly to benefit the individual, with helping others becoming secondary thought at most. However, Jesus recalls different narratives absorbed at his mother's side and strengthened through years examining scrolls holding the understanding of generations. Abraham, departing the safety and certainty of his homeland for unclear wandering in Canaan because the Almighty summoned him toward something greater than protection. Moses selecting association with Hebrew captives over advantage in Pharaoh's residence because fairness mattered beyond individual progress. David, declining to eliminate Saul regardless of possessing chance and reason because certain foundations exceed practicality and vengeance. Authority degrades when it benefits only oneself, transforming into an instrument for ease rather than vocation, for individual gain rather than heavenly aim. Yet authority refines when it serves something exceeding personal requirement, when it transforms into a passage for devotion rather than a defense for self-preservation. The distinction exists not within the authority itself, which stays morally impartial, like flame that can prepare sustenance or consume structures, but within the spirit that controls it and the objective directing its application. The rocks distributed around Jesus' position could transform into anything his determination might select. Nourishment for present starvation, precious metal for coming security, armaments for defense against adversaries, symbols of sovereignty for wielding worldly dominion. Physical matter itself yields to heavenly instruction, like potter's clay, prepared to assume whatever form, devotion, or selfishness might press upon it. Yet will heavenly intention yield to matter's requirements? Will God's Son permit physical situations to command the application of miraculous capacity? Will necessity become the controller of the one who arrived to control necessity itself? This represents the examination concealed inside the transparent examination, the more profound challenge that the enemy anticipates Jesus will overlook while concentrating on the urgent difficulty of starvation and continuation. Will God's Son utilize his heavenly relationship to escape the mortal situation, ascending beyond the restrictions that characterize finite being? Or will he penetrate that situation more thoroughly, applying his capacity not as protection against hardship, but as connection toward fuller comprehension of what being human signifies? Jesus observes his hands, yet shaking with the frailty that arrives from 40 days of abstinence that has driven his physical form to the absolute limit of what it can withstand. Craftsmen's hands that previously molded timber into beneficial items, producing attractiveness and utility from unprocessed material through expertise and persistence. Hands that could reshape stones into nourishment if he decided to voice the expression that would terminate suffering and recover vitality. Rather, they stay vacant, exposed, quivering with starvation, yet firm in aim. The hunger maintains its persistent erosion. The frailty sustains its attack on tissue and skeleton. Yet something else surfaces from the refusal to employ authority for individual ease, something unanticipated and contradictory. A fuller authority that doesn't rely on situations or outside factors. Strength that genuinely develops more powerful through visible frailty. Like tissue that builds through opposition rather than comfort. Command that arrives not from the capacity to manage circumstances, but from the readiness to have confidence in something past management. The enemy's tone holds authentic bewilderment. At this point, as though a basic presumption regarding the character of logical conduct has been disputed by an unfathomable reaction. This wasn't the way the examination was expected to progress. Based on thousands of years of familiarity with mortal character, authority unused becomes authority squandered. Certainly requirement unaddressed when the resources of addressing it exist within simple access becomes merely senselessness. Yet Jesus has uncovered something the enemy cannot grasp, regardless of ages of watching and engaging with formed beings. Authority maintained in reserve frequently becomes more forceful than authority quickly applied. Strength that purposefully selects exposure becomes impervious in methods that compulsion cannot accomplish. Requirement that has confidence in heavenly nourishment discovers nourishment that addresses far beyond simple physical necessities. The initial examination transitions into recollection like a sickness that subsides after completing its duration. The rocks stay rocks, unaltered by mortal longing or heavenly capability. And deep, within the most profound spaces of the spirit, where character becomes created and nature becomes molded, a foundation establishes itself that will characterize all that comes next. Authority benefits devotion rather than personal concern. Strength benefits offering rather than ease. Heavenly capability discovers its supreme manifestation not in removing the mortal situation, but in penetrating it so thoroughly that change becomes achievable from inside rather than forced from outside. The barren land observes with the endurance of ancient time. The examination persists with the steadiness of weathering that reforms mountains particle by particle. And the character of genuine authority starts to expose itself in the most improbable location, in limitation rather than application, in confidence rather than management, in the extreme decision to stay exposed when protection exists within range of one voiced expression. The following trial, the highest point. The environment transforms with the smooth reasoning of visions where space compresses and time curves based on intention rather than natural law. One instant Jesus rests among distributed rocks in the desert hollow that has served as his refuge. Frailty pressing against his skeleton like heavy burdens. The following instant he occupies the uppermost location of Jerusalem's sacred structure, wind pulling his coarsely woven garments. The consecrated city displayed underneath like a complex chart drawn by heavenly designers across undulating terrain. The summit of the sacred structure, the southeastern angle where enormous stone blocks ascend beyond the Kidron ravine like a precipice carved from solid rock. A descent that would destroy any mortal form, converting bone and tissue to distributed pieces on the rocks distant underneath. Yet also, the location where traditional teaching claims the Messiah will initially manifest in magnificence, descending from the sky to assert his legitimate position and create the realm that prophetic voices have declared for countless years. How did he come to be present? The inquiry breaks down like mineral in liquid before it can completely develop. Within the enemy's existence, regular principles that direct space and duration curve like young growth in powerful wind. Space becomes without significance. The achievable and unachievable move together in designs that make separating between them as challenging as distinguishing visions from consciousness in the instance between rest and awareness. The city underneath bustles with midday existence that proceeds unaware of the situation developing high overhead. Traders advertise their products in confined passages where burden animals push through masses of visitors and residents. Sellers offer liquid and nourishment and preserved fruit to wanderers who have traveled from remote territories to honor in the sacred structure that ascends like a peak of pale stone and precious metal. Young ones engage in darkened enclosures while mothers observe from entryways. And elderly women share narratives that maintain recollections older than the rocks under their position. Everything appears diminutive and remote from this unattainable elevation, like representations carved in reduced scale by a sculptor with heavenly endurance and boundless focus on particulars. The sounds of mortal movement ascend like fragrant smoke, tones summoning in numerous languages, creatures making their sounds, wheels groaning over paving stones, smoothed by generations of visitors seeking the Almighty. Within this location where sky and ground are claimed to converge, the enemy's tone arrives again, refined and scholarly at this point. No longer the basic desert trader presenting practical answers to urgent difficulties. At this location, he communicates like an educated scholar, referencing writings with scholarly exactness. A religious instructor examining refined aspects of theology with the ease of someone who has reviewed every document and committed to memory every passage that holds significance. If you represent God's Son, cast yourself downward. For the text declares, "He will instruct his messengers regarding you, and upon their hands they will support you upward, preventing your foot from striking against a rock." Sacred Writings 91, passages 11 and 12. Jesus understands the section completely, committed to memory in youth, alongside innumerable other passages that create the basis of Hebrew understanding and belief. The declaration of heavenly defense for those who have complete confidence in divine attention. Messengers as protectors, designated to observe the devoted. Miraculous safety for those who make the Lord their shelter and residing location. The reference is verbally flawless, precise to the smallest particular, presented with the accuracy of someone who has completed thorough preparation and arranged his reasoning with scholarly attention. This isn't basic enticement depending on transparent falsehoods or feeling manipulation, but advanced theology that would successfully pass review in any religious academy. Examine the reasoning, refined in its directness and persuasive in its visible soundness. You assert to represent God's cherished Son, selected and consecrated for heavenly aim. Writings clearly declare defense for divine offspring, miraculous involvement to avoid even minor harm. Demonstrate both assertions at once with one spectacular action. Leap from this unattainable elevation and permit the sky to exhibit its dedication to your purpose before observers who could never question what they observe with their own vision. The wind bursts more forcefully, as though the atmosphere itself promotes him toward the boundary where rock encounters vacancy. Distant underneath, sacred structure protectors walk their regular circuits, tiny as insects from this elevation, unaware that the destiny of formation may suspend in the equilibrium of one decision made in the area between ground and atmosphere. One movement ahead would examine all simultaneously, heavenly relationship exposed through miraculous deliverance, written declarations confirmed through wondrous involvement. The dependability of the sky itself, exhibited through messenger defense that rescues him from destruction, while demonstrating his character to any who might yet maintain question. Yet Jesus identifies the snare concealed under flawless theology, the toxic device hidden inside the appealing bait of apparently sound logic. Certainly, the sacred song declares heavenly defense for those who have confidence in the Almighty. Yet it presumes confidence established in belief, not boldness, disguised as commitment. It addresses walking in divine intention and discovering safety there, not requiring that the Almighty benefit mortal intention through impressive exhibitions. The distinction between belief and boldness may seem refined to informal watchers, but it penetrates to the absolute core of the connection between formed being and former. Belief has confidence in divine nature and arrangement even when situations propose desertion or postponement, Boldness requires evidence that the Almighty exists and provides attention, examining heavenly devotion through stipulations that convert connection into exchange. The enemy observes with the endurance of someone who has participated in this activity across ages, assured that the reasoning of his position will finally overcome whatever hesitations might produce delay. The proposition suspends in the atmosphere like fragrant smoke, pleasant with the declaration of evidence, definite that would silence every question and make belief needless permanently. This represents the attraction of the impressive, the longing to bypass the gradual work of constructing confidence through consistent devotion. For what reason struggle with unknowns when miracle could remove all inquiry? For what reason permit question to continue when exhibition could force acknowledgement? For what reason tolerate the slow procedure of gaining spirits when authority could compel recognition? Jesus observes downward at the masses, assembling in the sacred structure enclosures for midday prayers. Numerous seek indicators and marvels, yearning for evidence that the Almighty exists and provides attention regarding mortal hardship, confirmation that makes confidence simpler, exhibition that eliminates the danger inherent in belief. Yet what form of acceptance demands evidence to maintain it? And what form of evidence could conceivably fulfill question that has previously determined not to accept? The Hebrew people observed the Red Sea divide before their vision, barriers of liquid restrained by heavenly instruction while they walked across on waterless ground. Still, they protested regarding nourishment and liquid, still questioned divine existence and nourishment, still created precious metal representations when Moses postponed his arrival from Mount Sinai. They consumed manna that manifested like moisture every dawn, sustenance from the sky that maintained existence in the barren land. Still, they complained regarding the selection and yearned for the cooking vessels of Egyptian captivity. Indicators persuade solely those previously ready to accept. Marvels alter situations, but infrequently alter spirits that have solidified against the capability of heavenly devotion. The religious authorities will observe Jesus elevate Lazarus from mortality and quickly scheme to eliminate both the marvel performer and the confirmation of his capacity. Evidence becomes troublesome when it disputes presumptions that individuals prefer to preserve. Yet the fuller concern exists in the character of connection itself. The basic inquiry of what connects spirits together across the separation between mortal requirement and heavenly devotion. Devotion that requires evidence before it can have confidence stops being devotion and transforms into assessment rather. Belief that demands assurances before it can dedicate changes into simple carefulness. Confidence that demands exhibitions transforms into a commercial arrangement where affection must be gained through achievement. You must not examine the Lord your Almighty to trial. The expressions ascend from the identical profound source that furnished the previous reaction, voiced with calm command that holds more significance than proclaimed declarations. Another reference from Moses. Another teaching absorbed throughout desert wandering. When the Hebrew people required evidence of divine existence rather than having confidence in the regular confirmation of heavenly attention, the Hebrew people examined the Almighty at Massah, a location whose designation signifies examination, requiring liquid with the aggressive inquiry, "Does the Lord exist among us or not?" They obtained liquid from a rock struck by Moses' rod, yet the location maintained its designation as a lasting reminder. Examining the Almighty exposes not heavenly devotion, which stays steady as daybreak, but mortal absence of belief, which changes like wind path. The wind subsides to flawless stillness, as though the ground itself restrains its respiration, while universal foundations suspend in the equilibrium. The city underneath maintains its traditional patterns. Traders and visitors and devotees proceeding with their regular activities, unaware that the absolute character of heavenly connection is being determined high beyond their positions. The enemy's existence transforms again, recalculating with the frigid exactness of a calculator whose formula has generated an unanticipated outcome. This was intended to be the refined examination, the theological one that employed writing itself as an armament against belief. The dispute disguised as commitment, the snare attracted with declarations that sound like heavenly disclosure. Yet again, the anticipated reaction fails to appear. The one being examined declines to examine in response, selecting confidence over evidence, connection over exchange, belief over the impressive exhibition that would remove uncertainty permanently. Jesus moves backward from the boundary, not in alarm of descending, but in comprehension of what descending would signify. The summit stays solid under his position. The city maintains its existence distant underneath, and the foundation of belief stays intact, unstained by requirements for evidence that would change heavenly connection into mortal manipulation. The Almighty is not examined, but relied upon, not demonstrated, but cherished, not forced by mortal requirement, but encountered in the calm location where spirits expose without assurance. Where belief selects exposure over safety, where devotion risks dissatisfaction rather than requiring protection against disappointment. The following trial breaks down like vapor on the wind. The examination moves unavoidably toward its peak, toward the concluding proposition that will expose the final decision, confronting not simply this individual, but every mortal spirit that has ever considered what it would require to obtain the complete existence. The final trial, the realms of the existence. The sacred structure summit dissolves like watercolor in precipitation, its firm rock and ascending elevation breaking down into recollection as the environment changes with unattainable smoothness. At this point, Jesus occupies a mountain summit so raised that regular geography becomes meaningless, as though he has been elevated to a location where the bending of the ground itself becomes observable and realms distribute in every path, like precious stones distributed across a universal surface. At this location exists Rome, with its military forces marching in flawless arrangement across passages that join three landmasses. Its water channels transporting liquid across unattainable spans, its regulations forcing structure on disorder from Britain to Mesopotamia. There rests Babylon adjacent the Euphrates, traditional and enigmatic, its suspended gardens extending toward the sky like prayers made observable. Its repositories holding the understanding of generations written on clay panels that maintain knowledge older than recollection. Egypt extends along the Nile like a verdant ribbon placed across golden sand, its pyramids ascending like markers to permanence. Its sacred structures occupied with religious leaders who benefit deities whose designations resound through ages. Persia distributes its domain across territories that contact three landmasses, its capital gleaming with precious metal and valuable stones. Its military forces, instructed by commanders who reform charts based on royal intention. Everything observable from this unattainable observation location that opposes every regulation of vision and geography. Everything gleaming with authority that reforms countries and riches that could sustain land masses. Cities that direct trade passages, joining remote territories. Military forces that march to the pattern of domain-constructing ambition. Holdings occupied with precious metal and silver and valuable stones that could support visions past mortal creativity. The enemy's existence develops more powerful at this location, more firm and considerable than in earlier encounters. No longer simply a tone without observable form, but something that assumes shape inside vision. Attractive and frightening as celestial light. Traditional as the initial rebellion against heavenly command, enduring as rock molded by ancient duration. Everything these I will provide you, if you will descend and honor me. No writing references this occasion, no theological positions dressed in scholarly language, no appeals to heavenly declarations that might validate the requested action, simply unprocessed proposition placed exposed like cards facing upward on a wagering surface. Authority over every country that holds significance, riches past measurement, control over all that molds mortal record and establishes the destiny of countless individuals. Consider thoroughly regarding what could be accomplished with such command concentrated in virtuous hands. Fairness for the dominated, who summon for freedom from structures that crush them under the mechanisms of domain. Nourishment for the starving, who perish within sight of storage facilities occupied with grain accumulated by the prosperous. Harmony between countries that have understood solely conflict, their offspring elevated on narratives of traditional animosity that continue patterns of vengeance and aggression. Rome's military forces could march for virtue rather than seizure, their controlled strength benefiting fairness rather than domain ambition. Egypt's enormous riches could elevate the impoverished, rather than constructing markers to deceased rulers whose designations signify nothing to offspring who starve in Nile territory settlements. Babylon's gathered understanding could benefit reality rather than mortal arrogance. Its scholars working to address the difficulties that trouble humanity rather than creating new methods to concentrate authority in fewer hands. The proposition holds frightening reasoning that develops more persuasive. The extended, it suspends in the superheated atmosphere between tempter and tempted. 4. What reason select the challenging path of slow persuasion when the simple path of quick command guides to the identical final location? For what reason welcome hardship when hardship can be prevented through a basic action of realistic accommodation? For what reason accept mortality when control exists within range of one yielding? Jesus observes everything distributed before him like a feast arranged for a conquering ruler, senses the significance of capability pressing against his awareness like physical force, envisions the benefit that could flow from such authority controlled with flawless understanding and boundless sympathy. No additional requirement to persuade individuals, one spirit at a time, through instruction that numerous reject, no additional stipulation to gain converts through enduring exhibition of heavenly devotion. Simply decree fairness and observe it progress across landmasses like daybreak. The vision broadens with cinematic particulars that makes the proposition almost impossible to decline. Captivity abolished by domain declaration. Starvation terminated through reorganization of accumulated riches. Conflict removed through strength too overwhelming for any country to dispute. The realm of the Almighty, created not through the gradual work of change, but through the quick implementation of heavenly intention, supported by worldly authority. Yet the requirement suspends in the atmosphere between them like a blade suspended by the most delicate thread, honor, devotion, yielding the position to authority that declares all and presents captivity dressed in the appealing garment of freedom. This represents the oldest attraction understood to aware beings. The initial decision that generated the initial banishment from paradise. The serpent's communication in Eden's garden held the identical seductive reasoning. You will resemble the Almighty, understanding benefit and harm. The declaration that formed beings can transform into formers through the basic action of rebellion against the regular structure that positions heavenly intention beyond mortal longing. The realm distributed underneath like an enormous selection arranged for someone with boundless appetite and unrestricted duration to sample every delicacy. Each one signifies mortal accomplishment at its summit. The finest that civilization can generate when intelligence and ambition combine with adequate resources and beneficial situations. Construction that opposes gravity, elevating rock to unattainable elevations through planning that appears almost magical. Expression that captures attractiveness and maintains it against the weathering of duration, generating items that communicate to the mortal spirit across generations and cultural boundaries. reasoning that struggles with final inquiries regarding significance and aim, pursuing reality through logic applied to the enigmas of being, everything accessible for the value of one yielding. One instant of recognition that authority arrives before foundation. That, the conclusion validates any resources necessary to accomplish it. That heavenly purpose can be satisfied through accommodation with its contrary. Yet Jesus recalls other realms, different patterns of command that function based on different foundations completely. David's domain constructed on agreement rather than seizure, where the ruler benefited as guardian of his individuals rather than their controller. Solomon's understanding that prospered when heavenly direction molded mortal governance, generating fairness that defended the frail and prosperity that blessed the devoted. The prophetic voices described an approaching realm where fairness cascades downward like liquid and virtue like a powerful current, where blades are transformed into farming tools and countries absorb conflict no additional, where the comprehension of the Lord covers the ground as liquids cover the ocean. That realm cannot be created through accommodation with its contrary, cannot be constructed on bases that dispute its fundamental character. Illumination doesn't develop more radiant by making arrangements with obscurity that reduce its fundamental clarity. Reality doesn't transform more genuine by accommodating falsehoods that undermine its basis. Devotion doesn't transform more forceful by partnership with animosity that degrades its motivation. Depart, adversary, for the text declares, "You must honor the Lord your Almighty, and him solely must you benefit." The expressions resound with conclusiveness that makes peaks shake, and ravines resound with command that arrives from the center of formation itself. Not voiced this occasion like the earlier reactions, but declared with authority that permits no position, no discussion, no accommodation. The initial direct designation of the enemy, removing all appearance and exposing the genuine character of what has been presenting logical answers to transparent difficulties. The initial instruction that holds the significance of heavenly command, applied without regret or clarification. Every appearance descends like rejected coverings at the conclusion of a costume gathering. The attractive realms, with their gleaming capabilities, the logical propositions dressed in the language of realistic understanding, the seductive reasoning that makes hardship appear needless when authority could remove it with an expression. In their location stands the severe decision that has constantly been at the spirit of aware being. Whom will you benefit? What will you honor? Where will final devotion remain when every other consideration has been removed? The mountain summit breaks down like sweetener in precipitation. The realms dissolve like false images that vanish when approached excessively closely. The enemy's existence diminishes, then removes completely, yet not before presenting a concluding communication that holds the significance of declaration and danger combined until a favorable occasion. A reminder that this examination signifies temporary relief rather than concluding triumph. That the decision between benefit and honor will arrive again in different forms, displaying different coverings, presenting different attractions that appeal to different aspects of mortal character and heavenly purpose. Yet for the present, stillness returns to the barren land. Wilderness, stillness that no extended seems vacant, but occupied, heavy with capability that arrives not from accommodation, but from dedication. Not from authority grasped, but from authority surrendered to greater aim. Not from the realms of this existence, but from the realm not of this existence, still for this existence. The three trials have transitioned like sickness visions that abandon the individual, frail yet restored. The 40 days progressed toward their conclusion like a musical composition approaching its concluding movement. And deep within the most profound spaces of the spirit, where character becomes created and nature becomes molded, the character of genuine realm starts to expose itself, not constructed on control, but on benefit. Not created through management, but through devotion. Not preserved by compulsion, but by offering that changes frailty into strength. loss into triumph, mortality into existence that cannot be conquered by any worldly authority. The barren land arranges to discharge its captive. Yet he departs as something different than what penetrated. The examination changes into victory, and the cherished Son uncovers that rejection of false realms, exposes the entrance to the solely realm that finally holds significance. The realm that arrives not through seizure but through a wooden beam, not through authority but through absence of authority, not through governing the existence but through rescuing it. The significance of rejection. Envision Jesus occupying that mountain summit, observing downward at realms distributed like a chart under him. The tempter's proposition suspends in the atmosphere like dawn vapor. Every authority in the existence, every riches, every management, one basic yielding, one instant of honor, all could belong to him. Yet Jesus rotates away. He voices those concluding expressions. Honor the Lord your Almighty, and benefit him solely. The significance of that rejection resonates through record. Within that instant, he selected a different path completely. Consider regarding what he rejected. Not simply worldly authority, but the simple method, the bypass, the path that would prevent him hardship. Every ruler who ever existed would have leaped at such proposition. Every conqueror who ever marched across landmasses envisioned of such control. Still, Jesus observed at everything and declared, "No." This rejection exposes something profound regarding the character of heavenly devotion. Genuine authority doesn't grasp or seize, it benefits, it offers, it curves downward to elevate others upward. The tempter presented Jesus a symbol of precious metal, yet Jesus was previously walking toward a symbol of suffering. The universal significance of this instant cannot be exaggerated. At this location was the pivot location of record. One decision could have altered all. Jesus could have governed from residences rather than walking dusty passages. He could have instructed military forces rather than cleaning positions. He could have existed in abundance rather than perishing on a wooden beam. Yet that would have been the adversary's realm, not the Almighty's. The tempter's proposition arrived with conditions attached. Descend downward, honor me, benefit my aims. Exchange your spirit for worldly achievement. Jesus observed through the gleaming exterior to the toxic substance under. His rejection generated a fresh form of realm, not constructed on compulsion or alarm, but on devotion and benefit. Not preserved by military forces, but by actions of sympathy, not broadening through seizure, but through offering. This reversed realm would perplex the existence for generations to arrive. The wooden beam looms significantly in this instant of rejection. Jesus could observe it previously, that timber section waiting in his coming. The tempter presented him a method around it. Bypass the hardship, prevent the agony, accept the simple path to authority. Yet Jesus understood that certain triumphs can solely arrive through visible loss. His rejection also communicates to the character of confidence. He had confidence that the Almighty's method, though more challenging, was superior. He had confidence that devotion would finally succeed over compulsion. He had confidence that surrendering his existence would somehow rescue it. This confidence would be examined again and again in the periods forward. The tempter's proposition exposes our own most profound longings. Don't we every desire management? Don't we every crave the authority to repair items, to make the existence yield to our intention? Jesus sensed those identical longings. He was thoroughly mortal after everything. The attraction was genuine because the yearning was genuine. Still, he demonstrated us another method. Authority applied for others, not individual. Strength demonstrated through mildness. Triumph accomplished through surrender. The realm of the Almighty functions by different principles than the realms of this existence. This rejection would resound through Jesus' complete mission. When masses desired to make him ruler by compulsion, he withdrew away. When his followers envisioned of worldly magnificence, he communicated of benefit. When they extended for blades, he selected to restore. Every decision reflected this instant in the barren land. The tempter presented Jesus, the existence's characterization of achievement, impact, riches, acknowledgement, the capacity to make items occur. Yet Jesus redefined achievement itself. Genuine achievement signifies devotion, not recognition. Genuine riches signifies liberality, not gathering. Genuine authority signifies empowering others. His rejection also indicates to the enigma of heavenly limitation. The Almighty could compel submission, but selects to request it. The Almighty could force honor, but longs for it independently provided. The Almighty could govern through force, but governs through devotion. This barren land instant captures that heavenly decision to restrict authority in benefit of connection. The realms of this existence ascend and descend, domains collapse, ruling families terminate. Yet the realm Jesus selected that day maintains to develop calmly, one spirit at a time. Not through seizure, but through transformation. Not through alarm, but through belief. Not through compulsion, but through devotion. Occupying there on that peak, Jesus could observe everything. The agony forward, the rejection, the disloyalty, the wooden beam. Yet he could also observe past it. Revival dawn, existences changed, anticipation recovered, devotion victorious. He selected the more challenging path because he could observe where it guided. This instant of rejection transforms into a pattern for every who pursue. When confronted with the simple method or the correct method, select the correct method. When presented bypasses that accommodate foundations, decline them. When attracted to apply others for individual benefit, oppose. The path of devotion is constantly the superior path, even when it requires more. The tempter's concluding proposition was genuinely an examination of nature. Would Jesus be seduced by the shimmer of worldly achievement? Would he exchange his mission for individual ease? Would he select the quick over the permanent? His rejection exposed the fullness of his dedication to the Almighty's aims. The tempter withdraws. The enemy's removal arrives calmly. No spectacular departure, no thunderous exit, simply a slow dissolving like darkness retreating before dawn. The tempter simply moves backward into whatever domain he originated from, yet his departing expressions hold a threatening significance. I will arrive again at a favorable occasion. This isn't loss in the regular meaning. It's more like a calculated withdrawal. The tempter has examined Jesus' determination and discovered it unbreakable, at minimum for the present. Yet he's absorbed something valuable. He's observed the force locations. He's recognized the regions where Jesus might be exposed. He'll return when situations are more beneficial. Consider regarding that phrase, a favorable occasion. When would that exist? Maybe when Jesus is exhausted from mission, perhaps when the masses rotate against him. Conceivably, when his own followers start to question, the tempter is enduring. He can observe for the correct instant to attack again. This instructs us something vital regarding the character of attraction itself. It's infrequently one conclusive conflict. More frequently, it's a sequence of encounters distributed across an existence. We confront the identical basic attractions repeatedly, simply dressed in different garments. The tempter who departed Jesus in the barren land would arrive again in different forms throughout his mission. Examine how these identical three attractions manifest later in Jesus' narrative. The rocks to nourishment attraction arrives again when the mass desires to make him ruler after the nourishing of the 5,000. The sacred structure, leaping attraction, resonates when individuals require indicators and marvels. The realms of the existence attraction re-emerges throughout his victorious penetration into Jerusalem. Even his nearest companions would transform into unintentional agents of attraction. Peter, attempting to defend Jesus from hardship, transforms into a tempter himself. "Retreat behind me, adversary," Jesus would declare, identifying the identical tone he absorbed in the barren land. The tempter doesn't constantly arrive with horns and pitch device. Occasionally he arrives through the tones of those we cherish most. The Garden of Gethsemane would represent another favorable occasion. Jesus, confronting the wooden beam, would struggle with the identical basic decision. Accept the simple method out, or accept the Father's intention. The tempter may not have manifested observably, yet the identical selections were there. Departure or tolerate, ease or wooden beam. This design of removal and arrival reflects the pattern of spiritual existence. We possess triumphs, instants when we sense powerful and unbreakable. Yet then arrives the examination again, perhaps in a different form. The tempter is steadfast. He absorbs from each encounter. He modifies his method. The removal also exposes something regarding the character of harm itself. It's not everywhere present like the Almighty. It possesses restrictions. It can be opposed. It can be conquered, even if temporarily. Jesus' achievement opposition in the barren land demonstrates that attraction can be overcome. We're not powerless casualties of our longings, yet the declaration to arrive again maintains us modest. No one is past attraction. No one extends a location where they're protected to the enemy's designs. Even Jesus, recent from his barren land triumph, would confront these identical disputes again. Spiritual attention is an existence extended requirement. The removal also generates space for the messengers to attend. Occasionally we require to oppose attraction before we can obtain ease. Occasionally we require to demonstrate our devotion before we can encounter the Almighty's attention. The tempter's non-attendance makes chamber for the sky's existence. This temporary nature of the tempter's removal instructs us regarding the character of spiritual conflict. It's not one conflict, but a continuing effort. We gain certain encounters and surrender others. The essential is to maintain fighting, maintain opposing, maintain selecting the superior path. Each triumph makes us more powerful for the following dispute. The phrase favorable occasion also proposes that the tempter is calculated. He doesn't squander his energy on direct attacks when we're powerful and conscious. He observes, for instance, of frailty, perplexity, or disturbance. He reviews our designs, our exposures, our unseen locations. Jesus' encounter instructs us to be similarly calculated in our protection. When we're powerful, we arrange for frailty. When we're clear-minded, we make decisions for occasions when we'll be perplexed. When we're spiritually conscious, we construct patterns that will maintain us when we're disturbed. The tempter's removal also indicates to the authority of writing in spiritual conflicts. Jesus didn't conquer attraction through intention capacity solely. He controlled the expression of the Almighty like a blade. Each attraction was encountered with a particular passage. This wasn't arbitrary reference, yet exact application of heavenly reality to particular circumstances. The removal generates an instant of calm after the tempest. The examination is concluded for the present. The force is removed, yet this calm instant is also arrangement for what arrives following. Jesus will require the strength he's obtained at this location for the mission forward. The barren land has arranged him for the existence. The tempter's declaration to arrive again at a favorable occasion reminds us that spiritual existence is not a location, but a travel. We don't come to a location where attraction terminates. We develop in our capacity to identify it, oppose it, and recover from it. The tempter's removal is not the conclusion of the narrative, yet the conclusion of this section. Messengers attend. The stillness after the tempter's removal seems almost tangible. Jesus rests solitary on the rocky ground, his form diminished by 40 days of abstinence, his spirit exhausted by concentrated spiritual conflict. The wilderness wind holds solely the sound of his own respiration. Then, like daybreak after the extended darkness, the sky penetrates through. The messengers arrive mildly, not with display or heavenly instruments, but with the calm attention of caregivers tending an individual. They manifest as organically as dawn illumination, transporting what Jesus requires most: nourishment, liquid, rest, and the basic ease of not existing solitary. Envision this environment. Jesus diminished from his abstinence, obtaining his initial meal in beyond a period. The messengers don't simply deliver provisions and depart, they attend to him. The expression proposes continuing attention, enduring benefit, mild focus on his requirements. They remain until he's recovered. This instant exposes something attractive regarding the character of heavenly attention. The Almighty doesn't simply assist us tolerate trials. He tends to us subsequently. He doesn't simply provide us strength for the conflict. He furnishes restoration for the injuries. The identical Almighty who permitted the examination at this point transmits ease. The messenger's mission also demonstrates the correct sequence of spiritual existence. Initially arrives the examination, then the victory, then the tending. Jesus had to confront the tempter solitary, yet he doesn't have to recover solitary. After demonstrating his devotion, he obtains the sky's attention. Consider regarding what the messengers transported. Not abundance items or compensations for his triumph, simply the fundamental requirements. Nourishment for his starvation, liquid for his dryness, rest for his exhaustion. Heavenly nourishment frequently arrives in basic, realistic forms. The Almighty provides attention regarding our most fundamental requirements. The messenger's existence also benefits as a reminder of the spiritual reality behind physical being. We exist in an existence where sky and ground intersect. Messengers are functioning even when we cannot observe them. They attend to us in methods we may never thoroughly comprehend. This instant of messenger attention arranges Jesus for what arrives following. His mission is regarding to start. He'll confront masses, resistance, miscomprehension, and finally disloyalty. Yet he'll hold with him the recollection of this instant. The sky provided attention for him in his requirement. The sky will provide attention for him again. The distinction between the tempter's removal and the messenger's coming is notable. Harm withdraws when conquered, yet benefit rushes in to restore and recover. The tempter departed Jesus solitary. The messengers arrived to benefit him. This exposes the basic distinction between the realm of obscurity and the realm of illumination. Traditional Jewish custom communicated of messengers as the Almighty's communicators and attendants. They manifest throughout the Hebrew writings at essential instants, transporting ease, defense, and heavenly communications. Their existence at this location joins Jesus to this broader narrative of the Almighty's attention for his individuals. The messenger's mission also resonates the formation narrative. In Genesis, the Almighty furnishes for Adam and Eve in the garden. At this location, the Almighty furnishes for Jesus in the barren land. The attention is reliable. Even when the environments are different, the Almighty's character doesn't alter, he yet tends to mortal requirement. This environment also predicts Jesus' coming mission. Similarly, as messengers attended to him, he will attend to others. He'll nourish the starving, restore the unwell, ease the disturbed. The attention he obtains at this location transforms into a design for the attention he'll provide. The messengers transport beyond physical nourishment. They transport the confirmation of the sky's acceptance. Jesus has transitioned the examination. He's demonstrated his devotion. He's prepared for the mission forward. Their existence is like a heavenly marking of acceptance on his barren land encounter. Examine how this instant would have strengthened Jesus for the trials forward. When confronted with resistance, he could recall the sky's attention. When deserted by his followers, he could remember the messenger's existence. When perishing on the wooden beam, he could have confidence that mortality wouldn't be the conclusion. The messenger's arrangement is flawless. They don't arrive throughout the attraction to make it simpler. They don't interfere with the examination procedure. They observe until the conflict is gained, then they furnish what's required for recovery. This instructs us regarding the pattern of heavenly assistance. Their mission also proposes that spiritual triumphs frequently demand physical recovery. Jesus had disregarded his form throughout the abstinence. The messengers assist him recover his strength. We are complete beings, not simply spirits. The Almighty provides attention for every aspect of our being. The calm character of the messenger's benefit is deserving noting. They don't make a significant display of their assistance. They simply complete what requires to be completed. The finest mission frequently occurs without display in basic actions of attention and benefit. This instant also arranges us for the messenger's arrival at the conclusion of Jesus' narrative. They will attend to him again in the Garden of Gethsemane, strengthening him for the wooden beam. They will be existing at the burial place, declaring his revival. Messengers frame his worldly mission with their attention. The messenger's existence changes the barren land from a location of examination into a location of favor. The identical position that hosted spiritual conflict at this point transforms into a shelter of heavenly attention. This reminds us that the Almighty can apply any circumstance, any position, any situation for his aims. Their mission also benefits as a pattern for how we should provide attention for others. When someone has tolerated a trial, they require realistic assistance, enduring attention, and continuing support. The messengers demonstrate us what genuine mission appears like, addressing requirements without anticipating anything in response. Jewish barren land customs. The barren land holds profound significance in Jewish recollection. It's not simply vacant area between locations. It's the location where the Almighty molds his individuals, where nature is created, where belief is examined and refined. When Jesus penetrates the wilderness, he moves into a narrative that started generations before his arrival. Abraham wandered in the barren land, summoned by the Almighty to depart all familiar. The travel altered him from a wanderer into the father of countries. The barren land transformed into his classroom, instructing him to have confidence in the Almighty's declarations, even when situations proposed otherwise. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before the Almighty summoned him to guide Israel out of Egypt. Those periods of isolation arranged him for the greatest deliverance mission in record. The wilderness became his teacher in matters of patience, in lessons of humility, and in learning to rely on divine strength instead of human capability. The 40 years that Israel spent wandering through the wilderness serves as the foundational pattern for grasping spiritual development. When they departed from Egypt, they were enslaved people, yet they needed transformation into a unified nation. That desert environment functioned as their educational institution, as their preparation facility, as their location for complete metamorphosis. Each principle they absorbed came through difficult experience. Let's examine these connections. When Israel encountered starvation in that barren land, they received manna as sustenance. When Jesus confronts his own hunger, he declines to transform stones into loaves. While Israel complained bitterly regarding God's provisions, Jesus places absolute trust in his Father's provision. Israel did not pass their desert examination. Jesus succeeds in his. The prophet Elijah escaped into the wilderness after Queen Jezebel made threats against his existence. Completely drained and disheartened, he requested that God end his life. God instead dispatched an angel bearing nourishment and drink, and then communicated with him through a quiet murmur. That wilderness transformed into his sanctuary of healing and rediscovered mission. These narratives establish a recurring theme. The wilderness represents where God encounters his followers in the most personal ways. Removed from all distractions, separated from civilization's commotion, distanced from the deceptive safety that human accomplishment provides. Within that emptiness, God occupies the void with his very presence. Traditional Jewish understanding recognized the wilderness as a purification location. Similar to how precious metals undergo refinement through intense heat, human souls experience refinement through isolation. That intense heat eliminates everything that isn't essential. What survives is what genuinely has value. The wilderness incinerates all facade and preserves only what is authentic. This number 40 surfaces again and again throughout these wilderness accounts. 40 days and 40 nights of rainfall in the Great Flood, 40 years for Israel's wandering journey, 40 days for Moses atop Mount Sinai, 40 days for Elijah's trek to Mount Horeb. This number represents completion, represents fullness, represents a duration sufficient for genuine transformation to take place. When Jesus spent 40 days within the wilderness, it links him to this greater narrative. He isn't simply enduring a solitary ordeal. He's actively participating in Israel's continuous covenant with God. In places where Israel stumbled, he prevails. Where they voiced complaints, he demonstrates faith. Where they selected disobedience, he selects submission. The wilderness additionally symbolizes that space existing between divine promise and its fulfillment. Abraham was given promises, yet had to await their realization. Moses glimpsed the land of promise, yet passed away prior to crossing into it. Israel roamed for multiple decades between their enslavement and their settlement. The wilderness becomes that interval of waiting, of maintaining hope, of continuing to trust. Yet the wilderness isn't solely about the waiting process. It concerns the learning process. Israel discovered how to depend upon God's daily provision through manna. They discovered how to trust his direction via the pillar composed of cloud and flame. They discovered that their capability originated not from their personal resources, but rather from divine strength. The wilderness removes all pretense. Within urban environments, we're able to maintain the illusion of complete self-reliance. We possess stores providing food, taps delivering water, barriers offering safety. However, the wilderness reveals our fragility. We require assistance, we require provision, we require shelter, we require God. This state of vulnerability transforms into something valuable. When we recognize our weakness, we become capable of receiving strength. When we acknowledge our emptiness, we become available to be filled. When we admit we're lost, we become open to being found. The wilderness generates the necessary conditions for miracles. The Jewish teachers spoke about the wilderness as the location where Torah was delivered, not within any city or any palace, but rather in that desert. The most significant revelation throughout Jewish history took place in wilderness territory. This indicates that the most meaningful truths often get discovered in the most desolate locations. The wilderness also symbolizes liberty. Israel lived in bondage within Egypt, with all its systems and structures and cruelty. The wilderness presented harshness, yet it offered freedom. It proved better to face hardship in freedom than to exist comfortably while enslaved. The wilderness instructed them to prioritize liberty above safety. Those dwelling in deserts cultivated different capabilities than those living in cities. They mastered reading atmospheric patterns for weather predictions. They understand the locations for discovering water in arid regions. They possess the ability to navigate using celestial bodies when paths don't exist. The wilderness cultivates ingenuity, cultivates patience, and cultivates profound awareness of nature's patterns. Jesus inherits this entire wilderness tradition. He carries forward the memories of his forefathers' journeys. He's familiar with the accounts of God's reliability in those dry territories. He comprehends that the wilderness doesn't represent punishment, but rather preparation, doesn't represent banishment, but rather instruction. The wilderness also directs attention toward what lies ahead. Jewish prophetic writings described a coming exodus, a new wilderness journey, a new land of promise. Certain people anticipated the Messiah would guide them into desert lands to recreate Moses' wonders on an even grander magnitude. Jesus steps into the wilderness not for leading a new departure from bondage, but rather to embody the path himself. Those ancient routes through wilderness terrain become spiritual symbols, representing the movement from enslavement toward liberty, representing the progression from immaturity toward maturity, representing the advancement from uncertainty toward conviction. The wilderness transcends being merely a location to become a transformation process. These traditions provide Jesus' wilderness encounter with profound significance. He isn't merely a man abstaining from food in barren land. He represents the culmination of Israel's extended journey. He embodies the response to their age-old yearnings. He constitutes the realization of their wilderness aspirations. The psychological warfare. Picture the burden of absolute isolation. No human speech for 40 days. No recognizable countenances. No familiar patterns. Simply Jesus, alone with his mental processes, his starvation, and his divine purpose. The psychological strain would prove overwhelming even for individuals possessing remarkable inner fortitude. The bodily consequences of prolonged fasting generate their distinct mental difficulties. As the physical body utilizes its stored fat, the brain starts functioning in altered ways. Mental processes become more acute in certain aspects, more clouded in others. Feelings grow more intense. The separation between physical and spiritual existence becomes blurred. Rest becomes elusive when the body experiences starvation. The nighttime hours extend interminably, characterized by uncomfortable shifting on stony terrain. Dream states blend with conscious awareness. Recollections emerge without invitation. The mind, lacking normal external input, starts consuming itself. Think about the questions regarding identity that surely troubled Jesus throughout these solitary days. He understood he was God's son, yet what did that actually signify? How was he meant to manifest it? The heavenly voice from his baptism was progressively fading into distant memory. Did it genuinely occur? Was he genuinely summoned to this peculiar mission? The starvation wages its distinct psychological battle. Each stone starts appearing like bread. The physical form demands nourishment, while the consciousness attempts maintaining concentration on spiritual concerns. The tempter's initial proposition doesn't appear unreasonable. If you genuinely are God's son, why do you experience starvation? Certainly you could consume food and remain obedient. Isolation magnifies each uncertainty. Without companions to provide encouragement, without relatives to offer support, Jesus confronts his most profound anxieties in solitude. What if his understanding of his calling is incorrect? What if he's simply a confused craftsman from Nazareth? What if the purpose he senses is merely hunger-driven illusion? The wilderness surroundings themselves become mentally oppressive. The unrelenting sunlight throughout daylight hours, the severe cold throughout nighttime hours, the monotony of the terrain, the lack of verdant growing vegetation, the quietness interrupted solely by wind, and the sporadic sound of a bird. Sensory limitation generates its distinct variety of mental pressure. Recollection becomes simultaneously companion and adversary. Pleasant memories of home and relatives deliver brief respite from current anguish, yet they simultaneously emphasize his present solitude. He recalls his mother's prepared meals, his father's carpentry space, the uncomplicated enjoyments of ordinary existence. The difference makes his current circumstances appear even more severe. The psychological struggle also encompasses wrestling with his mission's character. He understands he's summoned to rescue humanity, yet how? The conventional anticipations of a Messiah involve military triumph, governmental authority, worldly recognition. Something profound within instructs him his journey will differ. The friction between anticipation and instinct generates inner turmoil. Anxiety becomes a perpetual presence. Anxiety regarding failure. Anxiety regarding selecting the incorrect option, anxiety regarding disappointing God, anxiety regarding failing all the individuals requiring salvation. The responsibility's magnitude for humanity's redemption would overwhelm most psyches. Even Jesus experiences the strain. The tempter's psychological approach proves sophisticated. He doesn't simply strike when Jesus shows maximum weakness. He awaits moments when uncertainties already exist, then intensifies them. He grasps legitimate worries and distorts them into enticements. He employs Jesus' own empathy against him. The solitude also generates opportunity for profound self-analysis. Without outside interruptions, Jesus must confront himself entirely. Every vulnerability, every ambiguity, every human constraint becomes enlarged. The wilderness eliminates all pretense and preserves only unfiltered honesty. Yet the psychological struggle possesses beneficial dimensions too. The seclusion permits unmatched closeness with God. Without rival voices, Jesus can perceive his Father's communication more distinctly. The quietness becomes a surface upon which divine interaction can be inscribed. The starvation, although agonizing, also generates mental acuity. When bodily requirements get reduced to fundamentals, the consciousness frequently attains exceptional concentration. Numerous spiritual seekers throughout history have documented deep spiritual revelations during fasting periods. The physical void generates capacity for spiritual abundance. The psychological strain also functions as readiness for what approaches. Jesus will encounter dismissal, incomprehension, and ultimately, treachery. The wilderness instructs him to discover strength in God exclusively, not in human acceptance or assistance. The isolation readies him for the supreme isolation of crucifixion. The struggle with his own consciousness perhaps represents the most crucial aspect of the wilderness encounter. Outside enticements prove relatively simple to recognize and oppose, yet internal uncertainties, anxieties, and psychological strains prove far more cunning. They present themselves as sensible worries or essential safeguards. The pattern of the 40 days probably involved rotating cycles of varying psychological conditions, instances of mental clarity succeeded by intervals of bewilderment, periods of spiritual capability, alternating with occurrences of human frailty. The struggle wasn't uninterrupted but rather cyclical, each surge demanding its particular response. Jesus' psychological endurance becomes an example for everyone confronting extended ordeals. He doesn't reject the challenge or claim it's simple. He recognizes the suffering while declining to permit it to dictate his decisions. He experiences the strain while preserving his dedication to his purpose. The wilderness also instructs Jesus regarding his own mind's capabilities. He uncovers that mental processes can prove more hazardous than outside situations. He masters distinguishing between genuine spiritual perception and psychological deception. He cultivates the mental self-control that will benefit him throughout his work. The psychological struggle in the wilderness ultimately gets won not via human determination, but rather via divine favor. Jesus' capability originates not from his personal mental strength, but rather from his connection with God. The wilderness instructs him regarding the distinction between human endurance and divine enablement. The political circumstances. The world Jesus inhabited wasn't politically impartial. Rome's unyielding control dominated the Mediterranean region, and Judea simmered with bitterness beneath foreign domination. The wilderness temptation transpired against this setting of political strain, revolutionary anticipation, and messianic hopes. Roman tax collection crushed ordinary citizens. Military personnel gathered tribute with brutal effectiveness. Regional puppet authorities like Herod advanced Roman objectives while feigning concern for Jewish matters. The temple structure itself had transformed into a representation of cooperation with the occupying authority. Into this unstable environment arrived successive waves of aspiring messiahs. Judas of Galilee had initiated a taxation rebellion. Theudas proclaimed himself a prophet and accumulated supporters. The Egyptian assembled thousands and vowed to defeat Roman authority. Each movement concluded in violence and intensified subjugation. The population's anticipations ran elevated for an alternative variety of leader, someone capable of shattering the Roman control, someone capable of re-establishing Israel's sovereignty, someone capable of making the nation powerful once more. The messianic anticipations carried intense political significance. Against this setting, the tempter's third proposal becomes particularly meaningful. All the world's kingdoms displayed like a chart. All the political authority anyone could envision. All the power required to liberate Israel and create God's kingdom on earth. The proposal was flawlessly customized to contemporary anticipations. Think about how readily Jesus could have rationalized accepting this enticement. The population required liberation. Rome demonstrated oppression. God's selected people merited superior treatment. Surely divine capability should get employed to accomplish divine objectives. The tempter's proposal appeared to correspond with God's intentions. Yet Jesus identified the snare. Political authority obtained through accommodation would remain permanently corrupted. A kingdom constructed on the devil's conditions would advance the devil's agenda. The methodology would inevitably corrupt the outcomes. Genuine liberation demanded an alternative strategy. The Jewish resistance fighters during Jesus' era employed violence for resisting violence. They confronted force with force. They maintained that righteous indignation justified any required methods. The Zealots would shortly demonstrate this ideology in the catastrophic uprising that annihilated Jerusalem. Jesus selected a fundamentally different course. Rather than confronting force with force, he would confront it with compassion. Rather than constructing a kingdom via conquest, he would construct it via sacrifice. Rather than demanding obedience, he would present service. The political ramifications proved astounding. This decision would perplex his supporters throughout his work. They continuously anticipated him to pursue political measures. They desired him to assert his authority, gather an army, expel the Romans. Even following his resurrection, they inquired if he would presently re-establish the kingdom to Israel. The tempter's proposal also discloses the enticing character of political authority. It guarantees rapid answers to intricate difficulties. It presents the capacity to compel transformation rather than await change. It attracts our frustration with unfairness and our wish to repair situations instantly. Yet political authority proves ultimately restricted. It can modify regulations but not inner convictions. It can adjust conduct but not reshape personality. It can generate temporary stability but not enduring harmony. The tempter's proposal was genuinely a diminished adaptation of what Jesus arrived to achieve. The Roman Empire, despite all its strength, was already starting to deteriorate internally. The political kingdoms throughout the world ascend and descend with foreseeable consistency. The tempter was presenting Jesus something ultimately temporary and delicate. Rather, Jesus selected to create a different variety of kingdom. One operating by alternative principles, one prioritizing service above authority, compassion above compulsion, sacrifice above self-centeredness. This kingdom would survive every worldly empire. The political circumstances also clarify why Jesus' teachings proved so menacing to the governing powers. He wasn't merely instructing regarding spiritual concerns, he was advancing an alternative method for structuring human community. His kingdom disputed the fundamental premises of political control. The religious authorities grasped the political consequences of Jesus' teachings. If individuals genuinely adhered to his instructions regarding loving adversaries, serving fellow humans, and distributing resources, the complete social structure would transform. They couldn't permit such threatening concepts to proliferate. The political enticement also surfaces in more refined varieties throughout Jesus' work. When the masses desired to declare him king following the feeding wonder, he confronted the identical fundamental decision. When his followers debated regarding who would achieve greatness in his kingdom, they were succumbing to the identical snare. The political circumstances make Jesus' declination even more exceptional. He possessed authentic empathy for individuals enduring beneath Roman authority. He desired to assist them. He possessed the capability to alter their situations. Yet, He selected a course that would ultimately benefit them more significantly, even though it appeared like defeat. The tempter's political proposal also discloses the superficial character of worldly answers. Replace the authorities, and you retain the identical structure. Substitute one empire for another, and you still possess empire. The genuine difficulty isn't who possesses authority, but rather how authority gets utilized. Jesus' rejection of political authority doesn't signify he was non-political. Everything he accomplished carried political consequences. Restoring the sick disputed a structure that disregarded the ailing. Providing nourishment to the starving suggested criticism of financial disparity. Accepting marginalized individuals undermined social stratifications. But his political approach differed. Rather than attempting to dominate the structure, he attempted to change it. Rather than seizing authority, he enabled others. Rather than governing above individuals, he assisted them. This constituted political engagement of the most fundamental variety. The wilderness temptation demonstrates to us that the compassion path frequently proves more challenging than the authority path. It's simpler to compel transformation than to motivate it. It's more rapid to demand submission than to gain it. It's more gratifying to destroy adversaries than to transform them. Yet, the extended consequences of Jesus' selection speak for themselves. 2 millennia subsequently, the Roman Empire exists as a historical artifact. The kingdoms the tempter presented have all disintegrated. Yet the kingdom Jesus selected to construct continues expanding, one changed inner being at a time. The narrative composition of the temptation. The account of Jesus' temptation reads like a skillfully constructed drama. 3 sequences, each intensifying in power. 3 proposals, each more enticing than the preceding. 3 declinations, each more absolute than the former. The narrative design discloses deliberate assembly beneath the spiritual reality. The introduction establishes the environment with visual accuracy. The Spirit guides Jesus into wilderness territory. 40 days of abstaining from food, severe starvation, the ideal preparation for what ensues. The reader comprehends something important is approaching. The suspense develops organically. The tempter's initial contact proves almost mild. If you constitute the Son of God, instruct these stones to transform into bread. Observe the conditional expression, not a straightforward directive, but rather a recommendation. The tempter introduces uncertainty while presenting relief. The narrative method proves advanced. Jesus' reply originates from Deuteronomy. Humanity shall not exist by bread exclusively, but rather by each word originating from God's communication. The reference proves exact, applicable, and conclusive. The sequence gets established. Temptation will encounter scripture. The subsequent temptation intensifies the drama. The environment shifts from wilderness to temple. The tempter references scripture himself, generating a confrontation of biblical understanding. The significance increases as the tempter disputes Jesus to demonstrate his identity via magnificent exhibition. Once more, Jesus replies with scripture, "You shall not challenge the Lord your God." The narrative sequence persists, yet the struggle heightens. The tempter demonstrates adaptation in his approach, revealing his cleverness and determination. The third temptation delivers the account to its peak. The tallest mountain, the most impressive vision, the most comprehensive proposal, all the world's kingdoms, in return for a solitary act of reverence. The tempter's ultimate attempt proves his most daring. Jesus' third reply proves the most vigorous. "Depart, Satan, for it stands written, you shall revere the Lord your God, and exclusively him shall you assist." The narrative crescendo reaches completion. The tempter withdraws. Angels provide ministry. The account concludes with flawless balance. The composition mirrors traditional dramatic foundations. Ascending movement develops through the 3 temptations. The peak arrives with Jesus' ultimate declination. The descending movement reveals the tempter's withdrawal. The conclusion delivers angelic consolation. The narrative skill proves undeniable. Each temptation focuses on a separate dimension of human character. The initial attracts to bodily requirement, the subsequent to mental pride, the third to spiritual aspiration. The advancement proceeds from fundamental to intricate, from uncomplicated to advanced, from personal to comprehensive. The Old Testament references Jesus employs aren't arbitrary. They all originate from Deuteronomy, particularly from sections regarding Israel's wilderness encounter. The narrative connection proves intentional. Where Israel stumbled, Jesus prevails. The symbolism proves accurate. The tempter's employment of scripture in the subsequent temptation adds narrative sophistication. He references Psalm 91, yet incompletely. He employs God's communication to entice Jesus from God's intentions. The narrative irony proves potent. Even divine truth can get distorted for corrupt objectives. The geographical advancement also fulfills narrative objectives. Wilderness to temple to mountain, solitude to public location, to universal perspective. The environments become progressively meaningful, corresponding the intensifying significance of each temptation. The narrative composition also discloses the tempter's methodology. He commences with Jesus's bodily requirement, a sensible beginning point. He advances to mental manipulation, more intricate yet still understandable. He concludes with spiritual seduction, the most refined and hazardous. The account's conciseness constitutes part of its narrative strength. Each scene gets compressed to its fundamental components. No superfluous particulars, no squandered language. The narrative proceeds with poetry's accuracy, each component benefiting the entirety. The conversation between Jesus and the tempter advances the account forward. No narrator interferes to clarify motivations or supply background. The personalities disclose themselves via their language and behaviors. The narrative method proves dramatically successful. The conclusion delivers flawless resolution. The tempter's withdrawal settles the struggle. The angel's presence delivers comfort following ordeal. The account concludes with a perception of finalization while suggesting future difficulties. The narrative composition proves satisfying. The account also operates as a narrative pattern for spiritual conflict. The sequence of temptation, opposition, and settlement can get implemented to any circumstance. The narrative structure instructs equally as the substance. The threefold composition surfaces throughout biblical writings. 3 days within the whale's interior, 3 denials by Peter, 3 crosses at Calvary. The number indicates completion, examination, and divine intention. The narrative custom proves ancient and purposeful. The account's positioning in the Gospels also carries significance. It arrives immediately following Jesus' baptism and preceding his public work commences. Narratively, it functions as a connection between his readiness and his purpose. The temptation must get confronted before the assignment can commence. The difference between the tempter's proposals and Jesus' replies generates narrative friction, instant satisfaction versus patient submission, magnificent exhibition versus quiet loyalty, worldly authority versus divine assistance. The narrative contrasts prove distinct and transparent. The wilderness environment itself possesses narrative significance. It's the examination location in biblical narrative. Abraham's expedition, Israel's roaming, Elijah's escape. The wilderness represents where personality gets disclosed and conviction gets demonstrated. The narrative symbolism proves abundant. The account's impact on subsequent literature proves enormous. Paradise Regained by Milton, The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. Innumerable additional works utilize this narrative sequence. The account has transformed into a pattern for portraying moral selection. Contemporary readers might overlook some of the narrative refinements that ancient audiences would have identified instantly. The Old Testament allusions, the geographical meaning, the theological ramifications. Yet the fundamental narrative composition remains influential across cultures and eras. The account operates on numerous narrative dimensions concurrently. Its historical narrative, theological dissertation, moral guidance, and dramatic presentation. The narrative abundance permits numerous understandings without sacrificing coherence. The tempter's withdrawal until a suitable moment delivers narrative anticipation. The struggle isn't genuinely settled, merely delayed. The account guarantees continuation, generating expectation for subsequent encounters. The narrative technique constructs anticipation. The narrative excellence of the temptation account discloses purposeful creativity. This isn't merely arbitrary documentation, but rather deliberate assembly. The writers grasped both the spiritual meaning and the narrative strength of the narrative they were maintaining. The temptation's resonance in Jesus' work. The three temptations in the wilderness weren't separate occurrences. They were previews of approaching developments, themes that would resurface throughout Jesus' work in alternative varieties. The tempter's communication would reappear, occasionally via unexpected channels. The initial temptation surfaces once more at the feeding of the 5,000. The masses are starving, just as Jesus had been in the wilderness. They desire him to supply nourishment to satisfy their instant bodily requirements. Following the wonder, they attempt to declare him king through compulsion. The identical temptation: employ divine capability for widespread acceptance. Yet Jesus perceives through their excitement. They're not pursuing the kingdom of God, they're pursuing complementary provisions. They desire a Messiah who will address their financial difficulties, not their spiritual ones. Jesus removes himself from them, just as he had declined to transform stones into bread. The subsequent temptation resonates when the Pharisees and Sadducees request a sign from heaven. They desire Jesus to demonstrate himself via magnificent exhibition. Leap from the temple peak, they appear to communicate. Reveal to us something remarkable. Confirm your assertions with undeniable wonders. Jesus declines their request, just as he had declined the tempter's challenge. He won't supply signs for the spiritually inquisitive or the theologically doubtful. Conviction that demands proof isn't genuinely conviction whatsoever. The identical principle that directed him in the wilderness directs him in public work. The third temptation emerges during Jesus' victorious entrance into Jerusalem. The masses distribute palm branches and proclaim Hosanna. They're prepared to designate him king, to provide him the political authority the tempter had presented. All he must accomplish is receive their praise and proceed to the palace. Rather, Jesus mourns over the city. He comprehends where this course directs, not to enduring harmony, but rather to annihilation, not to genuine liberty, but rather to profound enslavement. He rides a donkey rather than a war horse, indicating an alternative variety of kingdom than the one the masses anticipate. Even his nearest followers become inadvertent tempters. When Peter attempts to hinder Jesus from traveling to Jerusalem to endure and perish, Jesus identifies the recognizable communication: "Retreat behind me, Satan." The identical tempter who presented worldly kingdoms presently communicates via a cherished companion. The tempter's approach proves reliable, present shortcuts to deserving objectives, desire to provide nourishment to individuals, transform stones to bread, desire to demonstrate your divinity, leap from the temple, desire to create God's kingdom, receive political authority. The temptations appear sensible, even virtuous. Yet Jesus perceives through each disguise. He identifies that the objectives don't validate the methodology. The approach matters equally as the objective. A kingdom constructed on accommodation would remain permanently accommodated. Compassion accomplished via compulsion isn't genuinely compassion whatsoever. The temptations also surface in the reactions of different groups to Jesus' work. The masses desire him to become their bread supplier, their wonder performer, their political liberator. They're inadvertently repeating the tempter's recommendations from the wilderness. Religious authorities request signs and wonders just as the tempter had challenged Jesus to cast himself from the temple. They desire proof on their conditions, confirmation that corresponds their anticipations. They can't receive a Messiah who declines to perform by their regulations. Political figures like Herod and Pilate symbolize the third temptation. They present Jesus' possibilities to obtain worldly authority via accommodation. Participate in our structure, they appear to communicate. Function within the establishment. Employ political impact to accomplish your objectives. Yet Jesus reliably selects the more challenging course. He provides nourishment to individuals, yet not to accumulate supporters. He executes wonders, yet not to demonstrate himself. He disputes political structures, yet not to substitute them with his personal adaptation. His kingdom functions by alternative principles. The Garden of Gethsemane displays the supreme resonance of the wilderness temptations. Jesus confronts the identical fundamental selection: pursue the simple method or accept the Father's intentions. This occasion the significance proves elevated. Not merely personal ease, but rather existence itself. The tempter's communication may not be audible in Gethsemane, yet the identical alternatives remain present. Avoid this anguish, evade this sacrifice, discover another method. Jesus perspires blood as he struggles with the selection. Yet his response remains the identical. Not my intentions, but rather yours be accomplished. Even on the cross, the temptations persist. The masses ridicule. If you constitute the Son of God, descend from the cross. The dispute resonates the wilderness challenge. If you constitute the Son of God, cast yourself downward. The tempter's communication continues until Jesus' ultimate breath. The religious authorities participate in the mockery. He rescued others. He cannot rescue himself. They're inadvertently presenting the identical temptation. Employ divine capability for self-protection. Demonstrate your identity via self-rescue. Select the magnificent above the sacrificial. Yet Jesus remains reliable. He could descend from the cross, yet he won't. He could rescue himself, yet he selects to rescue others. He could demonstrate his divinity via authority, yet he demonstrates it via compassion. The wilderness selections remain solid. The resonances persist, even following the resurrection. When Jesus manifests to his followers, they still inquire if he will presently re-establish the kingdom to Israel. They're still contemplating in conditions of worldly authority, political liberation, magnificent exhibition, the identical temptations in fresh varieties. Jesus' reactions throughout his work disclose the profound wisdom of his wilderness selections. Every temptation he confronted there readied him for temptations he would confront subsequently. Every declination in isolation reinforced him for declinations in public. The wilderness constituted his preparation territory. The sequence instructs us something significant regarding spiritual existence. The temptations we confront aren't typically singular occurrences. They reappear in alternative varieties via alternative individuals and alternative situations. The tempter proves persistent and inventive. Yet the wilderness also instructs us that reliable selections generate spiritual energy. Each occasion Jesus selected loyalty above accommodation. The subsequent selection became simpler. Each wilderness triumph readied him for the subsequent public dispute. Personality gets constructed via repeated determinations. The resonances of the temptation account throughout Jesus' work reveal to us that spiritual conflict proves continuous. The tempter doesn't surrender following one defeat. He modifies, adjusts, and reappears with fresh approaches. Watchfulness gets demanded throughout the expedition. Understandings through history. The account of Jesus' temptation has fascinated interpreters for 2 millennia. Each generation has discovered fresh significance in the ancient narrative, perceiving reflections of their personal struggles and perceptions in the wilderness encounter. The earliest Christian authors perceived the temptation as evidence of Jesus' complete humanity. If he couldn't genuinely be tempted, then his triumph would prove insignificant. Yet if he confronted authentic temptation and conquered it, then he could genuinely assist others in their struggles. The account transformed into proof of both divine capability and human solidarity. The Desert Fathers, those early Christian hermits who escaped to the wilderness, perceived the temptation as a handbook for spiritual conflict. They identified the tempter's approaches in their personal desert encounters. The account transformed into their reference manual for identifying and opposing spiritual assaults. St. Augustine understood the three temptations as symbolizing the three fundamental human impulses: physical desire, pride, and aspiration. These correspond to what the Apostle John termed the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, and the arrogance of existence. The account transformed into a chart of human character. Medieval mystics like Meister Eckhart perceived deeper spiritual significances. The temptations weren't merely outside assaults, but rather inside struggles. The tempter symbolized the deceptive self, the ego that pursues gratification in worldly possessions. Jesus' triumph revealed the course to genuine spiritual liberation. Thomas Aquinas examined the temptations with academic accuracy. He investigated why the tempter contacted Jesus in this specific sequence, why these particular temptations were selected, and how they connected to the wider theology of redemption. The account transformed into a topic for organized theological contemplation. Throughout the Reformation, Protestant interpreters highlighted the function of Scripture in Jesus' replies. Martin Luther perceived the account as evidence that God's communication constitutes the supreme weapon against spiritual assault. The temptation transformed into a display of sola scriptura, the foundation that Scripture exclusively proves adequate for spiritual direction. The Puritans interpreted the account as a sequence for Christian existence. They perceived Jesus' 40-day abstinence as an example for spiritual self-control. His opposition to temptation transformed into a pattern for moral conduct. The account supplied practical direction for sacred existence. Enlightenment intellectuals contacted the account with fresh inquiries. Some perceived it as legend or allegory instead of historical occurrence. Others examined it as literature, valuing its dramatic composition and psychological perceptions. The account transformed into a topic for literary and philosophical examination. Romantic authors like John Milton discovered artistic motivation in the temptation narrative. Paradise Regained communicates the account in epic poetry, investigating the psychological and spiritual aspects of the encounter. The account transformed into a surface for creative articulation. Contemporary psychologists have understood the temptations as symbolizing separate dimensions of human psychology. The initial temptation attracts to fundamental bodily requirements, the subsequent to the requirement for acknowledgement and confirmation, the third to the wish for domination and authority. The account transformed into a case examination in human inspiration. Liberation theologians in the 20th century perceived political aspects in the temptation account. Jesus' rejection of worldly authority transformed into an example for opposing oppressive structures. His selection of assistance above dominance motivated movements for social fairness. The account transformed into a declaration for the powerless. Feminist interpreters have observed the lack of female communications in the conventional temptation narrative. They've investigated how the account might be grasped differently from women's viewpoints, especially concerning matters of authority, fragility, and opposition. The account initiated fresh discussions regarding gender and spirituality. Contemporary spiritual authors frequently understand the temptations as symbolizing separate phases of spiritual advancement. The initial temptation disputes beginners who remain concentrated on bodily requirements. The subsequent entices those who have accomplished some spiritual achievement. The third seduces those who have accumulated spiritual power. Process theologians perceive the temptation as proof of God's personal struggle and development. If Jesus was genuinely divine, then his temptation discloses something regarding the character of divinity itself. God encounters temptation, executes selections, and develops via the procedure. The account transformed into a window into divine encounter. Depth psychologists like Carl Jung perceived archetypal sequences in the temptation account. The wilderness symbolizes the unconscious. The tempter constitutes the shadow self. Jesus' triumph reveals the integration of conscious and unconscious components. The account transformed into a chart of psychological completeness. Eastern Christian customs have understood the temptations via the perspective of theosis, the procedure of becoming similar to God. Jesus' triumph above temptation displays the capability of human change. The account transformed into a direction to spiritual divinization. Pentecostal and charismatic Christians have highlighted the function of the Holy Spirit in Jesus' wilderness encounter. The Spirit directed him into temptation and enabled his triumph. The account transformed into a display of spirit-occupied existence and spiritual conflict. Postmodern interpreters have disputed conventional premises regarding the account's significance. They've investigated how separate cultural circumstances might generate separate understandings. They've inquired whose communications have been omitted from conventional interpretations. The account transformed into a text to be dismantled and reassembled. Contemporary neuroscience has presented fresh viewpoints on the temptation encounter. Investigation on abstaining from food, meditation, and solitude supplies perceptions into the psychological and bodily dimensions of Jesus' wilderness experience. The account transformed into a case examination in human awareness. Each understanding discloses equally regarding the interpreters as regarding the account itself. The temptation narrative transforms into a reflection, mirroring the worries, perceptions, and oversights of each generation. The account's abundance permits numerous interpretations without forfeiting its fundamental significance. The variety of understandings also displays the account's persistent applicability. Each era discovers fresh implementations, fresh perceptions, fresh disputes in the ancient narrative. The temptation account persists to communicate because it addresses essential human encounters that surpass cultural limitations. The history of understanding also reveals how the account has influenced Christian spirituality. Innumerable believers have discovered direction, consolation, and motivation in Jesus' wilderness triumph. The account has transformed into a spiritual asset, a foundation of capability for those confronting their personal temptations. Contemporary readers inherit this abundant custom of understanding. We don't contact the account in solitude, but rather as participants of an extended discussion spanning eras. The perceptions of former generations shape our comprehension, while fresh viewpoints persist to surface. Contemplation and inheritance. The wilderness temptation concludes, yet its impact extends through eternity. In 40 days of examination, Jesus created principles that would direct his work and motivate his supporters for eras. The selections executed in isolation would resonate through history. Think about what the world might appear like if Jesus had selected differently. If he had transformed stones to bread, would he have transformed into merely another wonder performer? Remarkable, yet ultimately restricted. If he had leaped from the temple, would he have been rejected as a performer pursuing attention? If he had received the kingdoms, would he have transformed into just another authority, however compassionate? Rather, his declinations generated something entirely novel, a kingdom constructed on assistance instead of authority, a conviction that flourishes without perpetual evidence. A method of existence that discovers capability in vulnerability, triumph in defeat, magnificence in humility. The wilderness selections produced a revolution. The temptation account communicates to the human situation in meaningful methods. We all confront instances when we must select between the simple course and the correct course, between instant satisfaction and extended benefit, between accommodation and genuineness, between assisting ourselves and assisting others. Jesus' illustration reveals to us that these selections matter more than we comprehend. The determinations we execute in private influence the individuals we transform into in public. The personality we cultivate in isolation establishes how we reply to strain. The wilderness instances ready us for the essential examinations. The account also discloses the character of authentic capability. The tempter presented Jesus' outside capability, the capacity to dominate situations, to direct resources, to control others. Yet Jesus selected inside capability, the capability to oppose temptation, to remain loyal, to assist instead of be assisted. This separation between capability above and capability within persists to dispute us. We exist in a world that celebrates the initial and frequently disregards the subsequent. We respect those who can execute occurrences, who can manipulate reality to their intentions. Yet the wilderness instructs us that the superior capability proves the capability to select our reply to reality. The temptation account also communicates to the inquiry of identity. Each temptation commenced with, "If you constitute the Son of God." The tempter was disputing Jesus' comprehension of who he was and what that signified. The declinations weren't merely rejecting behaviors, but rather confirming identity. We confront comparable identity inquiries. Who are we genuinely? What establishes us? Is it our accomplishments, our possessions, our capacities, or is it something more profound, something that can't be eliminated by situations? The wilderness instructs us that genuine identity originates from our connection with God, not from outside confirmation. The account resonates across cultures and eras because it addresses comprehensive human encounters, the desire for significance, the struggle with temptation, the selection between rival values. These themes surpass cultural limitations and communicate to the human inner being. Religious communities have discovered in the temptation account a sequence for spiritual self-control. The 40 days of abstaining from food have motivated innumerable believers to pursue their personal intervals of supplication and self-denial. The wilderness has transformed into a representation of the spiritual expedition, yet the account also communicates to secular audiences. The themes of genuineness, opposition to corruption, and dedication to principles resonate with anyone who has confronted moral selections. The account surpasses religious limitations to present wisdom for human existence. The temptation narrative also clarifies the character of corruption. The tempter isn't a cartoon antagonist, but rather a sophisticated opponent who comprehends human psychology. The temptations aren't evidently incorrect, but rather refined distortions of legitimate wishes. Corruption frequently arrives disguised as virtue. This perception carries practical consequences for how we navigate moral selections. The most hazardous temptations aren't the ones that appear corrupt, but rather the ones that appear sensible. The most enticing proposals aren't evidently corrupt, but rather appear to advance deserving objectives. The wilderness instructs us to investigate more profoundly. The account also discloses the significance of spiritual readiness. Jesus didn't confront the tempter inadequately prepared. He had invested years examining Scripture, cultivating his connection with God, clarifying his purpose. When the examination arrived, he was prepared. The principle proves transparent. Spiritual readiness matters. The inheritance of the temptation account extends far beyond personal spirituality. It has influenced art, literature, philosophy, and social movements. The principles Jesus created in the wilderness persist to dispute and motivate human civilization. The account inquires us uncomfortable inquiries. What would we accomplish in Jesus' circumstances? When confronted with starvation, would we select instant relief or patient reliance? When presented with recognition, would we select the attention or loyal assistance? When displayed with authority, would we select domination or surrender? These aren't merely theoretical inquiries. We confront adaptations of these selections consistently. The wilderness may constitute a specific location, yet the temptations prove comprehensive. The account's strength resides in its capacity to clarify our personal moral terrain. The temptation account also directs toward anticipation. If Jesus could oppose these temptations, then opposition proves achievable. If he could select the more challenging course, then we can too. If he could discover capability in vulnerability, then vulnerability need not constitute the ultimate communication in our accounts. The wilderness triumph doesn't guarantee simple existences for Jesus' supporters. It guarantees something superior. The capability of significant existences, existences that matter, existences that execute a distinction, existences that mirror the values of the kingdom Jesus selected to create. The account concludes where it commenced, with a selection. Will we pursue the course Jesus selected in the wilderness? Will we select assistance above authority, loyalty above recognition, genuineness above accommodation? The wilderness is summoning, and the selection belongs to us.